The dust had not yet settled around the iron-rimmed wheels when Lydia placed one small boot on the rough plank platform. The mountain air bit through her thin shawl, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and the heavier smell of horses and oiled leather. She kept her head high, though her fingers worried the torn edge of her faded blue calico dress, the fabric frayed from the long journey, and the hurried packing her family had forced upon her. A cluster of townspeople had gathered at the far end of the platform, their voices low, but not low enough. "Look at that scar," one woman murmured, the words turning sharp with laughter. "They say her own kin locked the door on her. Sent her here so the mountain man could have the last laugh." Another voice, a man's, carried farther. "Ain't no pastor gonna bless that. Bad luck walks with a face like hers." Lydia's breath caught, but she did not flinch. The thin pale line along her left cheekbone had stopped hurting months ago. It was the memory that still burned. The crack of the match, her brother's silhouette against the rising flames, the words he had spoken as the smoke thickened. "You lung thank me one day for making yourself useful to someone." She had climbed from the window, with her nightdress smoking at the hem. She had lived. They had made certain she would never be wanted again. If you have ever felt the eyes of a crowd turn cruel, or known the strange relief of one person choosing to stand with you instead of against you, then perhaps this story will sit with you a while. If it does, mote hope you'll share the part that stayed. A shadow fell across the platform. The crowd parted without being asked as a man taller and broader than any she had seen stepped forward. He moved like a tree deciding to walk. Slow, certain, the planks creaking under his weight. His storm-gray eyes met hers for a long moment. No smile touched his face. No greeting left his mouth. Only a single word, spoken low enough that only she and the nearest onlookers heard it. "Lydia." He turned his head slightly toward the cluster of people, and added, still quiet, "She says with me now." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The woman who had spoken first took half a step back. The laughter died. Lydia felt the air change again, this time into something heavier, something that pressed the mockery down like snow under a boot. Silas did not wait for permission or thanks. He crossed the last few feet between them, his boots heavy on the wood. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to see his face. Up close he was even larger, shoulders that blocked the weak sunlight, a chest that rose and fell with steady, unhurried breaths. He smelled of pine pitch and clean wool, and the cold wind that lived higher up the mountain. Without asking, he offered one large hand, palm up, rough with work but held steady. She hesitated only a heartbeat, then placed her smaller hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, with careful strength, not pulling, only supporting as she stepped the rest of the way down from the platform. The torn hem of her dress brushed his boot. He did not look at the scar. He looked at her eyes, and something in his gaze made the shaking in her knees ease by a fraction. He released her hand at once, and moved to the small trunk the driver had set on the platform. He lifted it, as though it held nothing more than feathers, and carried it to the waiting wagon without a word. Lydia followed, the shawl slipping from one shoulder. She caught it, pulled it tighter, and felt the eyes of the town still on her back. Silas set the trunk in the wagon bed, then turned and offered his hand again. This time he placed both hands at her waist, large, warm even through the layers, and lifted her onto the high seat with a single smooth motion. The touch was over before she could think about it. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The wagon rolled forward, the town falling away behind them. The road climbed almost at once. Pines closed in on either side, their branches brushing the canvas cover above their heads. The sound of the town faded into the creak of leather and the steady ring of the horse's shoes on stone. Lydia sat very still, the torn hem of her dress pooled over her knees. She could feel the warmth of the man beside her, even though he did not touch her again. After a mile, the wind picked up, sharp, and carrying the scent of snow that still lingered on the highest ridges. Without speaking, Silas reached behind the seat, shook out a heavy wool coat that smelled of wood smoke and leather, and draped it over her shoulders. The weight settled around her like an extra blanket. He did not look at her while he did it. He only adjusted the collar once with 2 fingers so it would not slip, then returned his hands to the reins. The small kindness settled somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. She studied his profile as the wagon climbed. His jaw was set against the wind, the dark beard catching bits of light that filtered through the pines. He had not asked about the scar. He had not stared. He had simply said her name and taken her with him. The letter her family had sent, in answer to the mail order, advertisement had been full of careful lies and uglier truths. She wondered hath ate parts of it he had believed. They rode in silence for a long while. The road narrowed, the trees grew thicker, and the light turned golden where it touched the tops of the pines. Far below, the timber town had become a scatter of roofs, no larger than matchboxes. Lydia's hands rested in her lap, one finger tracing the frayed edge of the torn hem. She thought of the fire again, not the flames themselves, but the quiet that had followed after she had escaped. The way her brother had looked at Moat 5 her, across the yard while the house burned, as if he had solved a problem. The way the neighbors had whispered the same words these people had whispered today. She had thought the mountains would be far enough. She had not expected the cruelty to travel with her, in other people's letters. Silas spoke only once during the climb. His voice was low, rough from disuse. The spring ahead runs cold even in summer. Wheels stop. He drew the wagon to the side of the road where a narrow trail led to a seep of water between moss-covered rocks. The horses blew and stamped. Silas climbed down, filled a dented canteen from the spring, and brought it back to her before he drank himself. She took it with both hands. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it tasted of stone and clean snow. When she handed the canteen back, their fingers brushed. He gave the smallest nod, the kind a man gives when words would only get in the way, then returned the canteen to its hook and climbed up again. The wagon rolled on. The cabin appeared between the trees without warning. It sat on a small rise, solid logs dark with age, a stone chimney sending a thin line of smoke into the late afternoon sky. A narrow porch ran along the front. One window held a lantern already lit, its glow warm against the coming dusk. Silas stopped the wagon in the yard, set the brake, and came around to her side. Again his hands found her waist, steady and brief, and he lifted her down. Her boots touched the packed earth. He did not release her at once. For a moment his eyes searched her face. Not the scar, but the tiredness around her eyes and the way her mouth had tightened from the long ride. Then he let go, took her trunk from the wagon bed, and carried it to the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke, and the faint bitterness of coffee left too long on the hook. A fire burned low in the stone hearth. The main room held a heavy table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk built against the far wall. On the table sat 2 chipped enamel mugs, one already used that morning. A lantern hung from a hook above the table. Silas crossed to it, struck a match, and lit the wick. The new light spread softly across the room and caught the edge of her scar. He did not look away from it. He simply turned the wick higher so the light would fall kindly. Lydia stood in the center of the room, the heavy coat still around her shoulders. The torn hem of her dress brushed the clean-swept floorboards. For the first time in months she was not being watched by strangers. The walls did not judge. The fire popped and settled. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Then she saw the letter. It rested on the high mantel above the hearth. The seal already broken. The handwriting across the front unmistakable. Her brother's careful script. Her name. The same hand that had written the reply to the mail order advertisement. The same hand that had struck the match. She took one step toward it. Silas moved at the same moment. He did not block her. He simply stood between the mantel and the table, his broad back to the fire. The light outlined the width of his shoulders and the quiet set of his jaw. When she looked up at him, his storm-gray eyes were steady. "You don't have to read it tonight," he said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. You already have. He nodded once. Mote have. She searched his face for the disgust she had learned to expect, the quick glance away, the tightening of the mouth. She found none of those things. Only the same quiet she had seen on the platform when he had spoken her name. The fire popped again, louder this time. Outside, the wind rose against the log walls and rattled the single window. She opened her mouth to ask the question that had been building since the wagon left the town. What had her brother written that this man had read and still chosen to meet the coach? What else had they told him about the fire, about her, about the scar? But before the words could form, Silas spoke again, his voice low and rough as bark. The coffee's still warm. Sit. The mountains don't hurry answers. He turned back to the hearth, added another log with one hand, and stayed there, his back to her. The light from the new flame danced across the floor between them. Lydia remained standing, one hand still clutching the edge of his coat where it hung past her wrist. The torn hem of her dress stirred in a draft that slipped under the door. The question she had not asked hung in the air with the smoke, unanswered. What had the letter truly said? And why, after reading it, had this giant of a man still come down the mountain to claim her? She sat. The chair was solid pine, built for a larger frame than hers, and her feet barely reached the floorboards when she settled onto it. The torn hem of her faded blue calico dress pooled around her boots like a small blue puddle. Across the table, Silas poured coffee from the pot into one of the two chipped enamel mugs. He chose the one with the smaller chip for her and set it down without a word, the steam rising between them in a thin, fragrant column. The smell of it, bitter, dark, and touched with the faint sweetness of molasses he must have stirred in earlier, filled the space between them and pushed back the colder scents of pine and old smoke. Lydia wrapped both hands around the warm mug. The heat seeped into her fingers, still stiff from the wind on the long ride. She lifted it, took a small sip, and let the taste settle on her tongue. It was stronger than she was used to, but it was real and hot, and made by hands that had not trembled when they met the crowd at the platform. She kept her eyes on the surface of the coffee for a moment longer than necessary. Because looking up meant looking at the man who had claimed her in front of everyone, who had come to watch her be humiliated. When she did look up, Silas was already watching her, not staring, just watching the way a man watches a trail he means to keep safe. He had not sat fully back in his own chair. One arm rested on the table, the other hung loose at his side, as if he might need to stand again at any moment. The lantern he had lit earlier threw soft light across the right side of his face and left the left side in shadow. The storm gray of his eyes had gone darker in the low light, like clouds that had not yet decided whether to break into rain. She set the mug down carefully. At the platform, she said, her voice quieter than she had intended. You said my name like you already knew it. Like you had said it before. What had, he answered. The words were short, but not unkind. The letter came 3 weeks ago. Your name was on it. So was the rest. Her fingers found the torn edge of her hem again and worried it gently. The fabric was soft from washing and travel. She smoothed it flat against her knee without thinking. They told you about the fire. They told me what they wanted me to believe about the fire. The distinction mattered. She heard it in the way he did not rush the words, in the way he let the fire pop and settle between one sentence and the next. She took another sip of coffee and felt the warmth move down into her chest. Outside, the wind had softened to a low murmur against the logs. Inside, the only sounds were the fire and the faint creak of the chair when Silas shifted his weight. She thought of the platform again. Not the laughter, but the moment his shadow had fallen across the planks and the voices had stopped. It had felt like someone drawing a line in the dirt with the toe of a boot and saying, without raising his voice, that the line would not be crossed. No one had crossed it. Even now, miles up the mountain, the memory of that single word, Lydia, and the quiet that had followed it, still sat inside her like a small, steady coal. Silas stood. The chair scraped once against the floorboards. He moved to the hearth, added another small log, and used the poker to settle the burning pieces so the flames would last longer. When he turned back, he noticed the wool shawl she had let slip from one shoulder. He crossed the room again, 3 long strides, and lifted the shawl with 2 fingers. He draped it back over her shoulders the same way he had placed the coat earlier, careful not to let the fabric catch on the lantern or brush too close to her face. His hands were large enough to span her shoulders easily, yet the touch was no heavier than the steam rising from the mug. He adjusted the edge once, so it would not slide again, then returned to his chair without comment. The small act of care settled somewhere behind her ribs, the same way the coffee had settled in her chest. She had not asked for the shawl. He had seen the need and answered it before the chill could find her. She traced the rim of her mug with 1 fingertip. "The letter on the mantel," she said. "You read it before you came down." "Mott did." "Did they tell you Mott started the fire?" His jaw tightened, just once, a small movement under the dark beard. His fingers, resting on the table, curled slightly around the edge of his own chipped mug. He did not answer at once when he did. His voice was lower than before. "They told me a story that would make any man turn away. They told me the scar was proof of guilt. They told me you would bring trouble and shame and that the town never would let a marriage stand if Mott took you." He looked at her directly then, the storm-gray eyes steady and unblinking. They were wrong about the guilt. They were not wrong about the trouble. The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water. Lydia felt the ripples move through her. She had expected him to lie, or to soften the truth, or to tell her the letter had said nothing of importance. Instead, he had given her the truth, in the same plain way he had claimed her on the platform, without flourish, without apology, and without turning away. She sat, vecipite, hatted, for a long moment. The firelight caught the edge of her scar and made it silver for a breath before the shadows returned. She thought of the town below them, of the faces that had watched her descend from the coach, of the woman who had laughed. She thought of the pastor, whose name had not yet been spoken, but whose shadow already seemed to stretch up the mountain road. And she thought of the man across from her, who had read every cruel word her family had written, and still lifted her onto the wagon seat, as if she weighed no more than the shawl he had just replaced on her shoulders. Silas rose again. This time he moved her chair a few inches closer to the hearth so the direct warmth would reach her without her having to lean. He did it without asking, the way a man moves furniture in his own cabin, because he has already decided what the person sharing his space needs. When he sat back down, the firelight reached her more fully. She felt the heat on her face and on the backs of her hands where they still held the mug. For a little while neither of them spoke. The coffee cooled in the mugs. The wind outside found a new path around the cabin and sang a softer song against the logs. Lydia let her shoulders ease by degrees. The torn hem of her dress no longer felt like a mark of shame. It felt like something that could be mended. She looked at the man who had mended nothing vecipite hot words, and yet had already begun to mend something far more important. Vecipite hot signs and small, steady acts. She was about to ask what he planned to do about the trouble her family had promised when a sound reached them from outside. Not the wind, not the settling of the cabin. The faint, rhythmic thud of a horse, hooves on the lower trail, still far below but climbing. The sound carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Lydia set her mug down. Someone is coming up. Silas did not move at once. His body went still in the way a mountain goes still before a slide, every line of him listening. He turned his head toward the single window, the lantern light catching the hard line of his jaw. After a moment he stood, crossed to the door in 3 strides, and opened it only wide enough to let the night air slip inside. The cold rushed in, carrying the clearer sound of the horse and the creak of leather. He stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other loose at his side, his broad back blocking most of the opening. The horse's pace did not slow. It was still a long way down the mountain, but it was coming. He closed the door without slamming it. The latch clicked into place with a sound that felt final. When he turned back to her, the storm-gray eyes had gone flat and hard, the way they had been on the platform when the laughter stopped. "Your brother did not only write a letter," he said. "He sent word ahead to the pastor. The writer is carrying the answer." Lydia felt the warmth from the coffee and the fire and the shawl drain out of her in a single breath. She stood, the chair legs scraping softly. The torn hem brushed the floor. She looked at the door, then at the man who had placed himself between her and every threat since the moment the stagecoach wheels had stopped turning. "What answer?" she asked. Silas did not lie. He never had. "The one that says no pastor in this valley will bless a scarred bride sent as a joke. They mean to make certain of it before the week is out." The wind outside found the door again and pushed against it. The fire popped once, sharp and loud. Lydia stood very still in the center of the cabin, the chipped mug cooling on the table behind her, the letter from her brother still unopened on the mantel. The rider's horse kept climbing, and the man who had claimed her, without hesitation, now stood between her and the door, as if the trouble her family had promised had already begun to knock. The knock came 3 times, firm and deliberate, as if the rider had decided that boldness would serve him better than the fear that had slowed his horse on the climb. Silas opened the door without a word. His body filled the frame completely, the lantern light from inside casting his shadow long across the porch and down the steps. The young man who stood there could not have been more than 20. He held a folded paper in one hand like a shield, and kept his other hand on the reins of the sweating horse behind him. The animal stamped and blew, its breath white in the cold night air. The smell of lathered horse and wet leather drifted up to the porch and mixed with the pine that clung to everything. "The pastor says he won to bless it," the rider announced. His voice tried for authority, but cracked on the last word. "Says a scarred woman sent as a joke is fit for holy matrimony. The whole town agrees. If you take her anyway, you know better than the family that mailed her here to mock you." Silas took the paper but did not unfold it. He looked at the rider the way a man looks at a storm that has not yet decided whether to break. When he spoke, his voice was low and carried farther than the rideress had. "Tell the pastor the choice belongs to the woman and to me. Tell him the mountains have their own ways of making things true." The rider shifted his weight. The sneer he had practiced on the way up faltered when Silas took one step forward. The boards of the porch creaked under his weight. "You'll regret standing they capite hatter when every door in the valley closes," the rider muttered. "Motvay regretted worse," Silas answered. "Go back the way you came. And do not bring another man's cruelty to my door again." The rider mounted in a hurry. The horse wheeled, hooves scattering small stones, and the sound of its descent faded quickly into the dark. Silas stood on the porch until the last echo was gone. Only then did he turn back inside. Lydia had not moved from where she stood near the table. The chipped mug she had been holding sat cooling beside the lantern. Her fingers still worried the torn hem of her dress, the fabric now twisted into a small knot between her thumb and forefinger. She looked small in the bay-ago room, the wool shawl he had replaced on her shoulders slipping again from one side. When he came back in and closed the door, she lifted her eyes to his face and saw the same steady gray that had met her on the platform. The steadiness steadied her in return, though her heart still beat too fast from the rider's words. Silas crossed to the hearth, poured what remained of the coffee into her mug, and brought it to her. The mug was warm again in her hands. He had chosen the one with the smaller tsar chip without comment, the way he had done earlier. She took it, and let the heat push back the cold that had crept in with the open door. "The air in here is thick with words that don't belong to us," he said after a moment. There's a trail behind the cabin that climbs a little way. The pines are thick there. It helps to walk when the world gets loud. She nodded. He took the lantern from its hook and held the door for her. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Stars showed between the moving branches. The wind had dropped to a low sigh that moved the tops of the trees like water. He walked beside her rather than ahead, the lantern held low, so its circle of light stayed on the path. The trail behind the cabin was narrow and wound upward between thick trunks. Pine needles crunched softly under their boots. The smell of resin grew stronger the higher they went, sharp and clean, and nothing like the smoke that had once clung to her clothes and hair. They walked in silence for a little while. The path curved around a boulder and opened onto a small clearing, where an old fallen log lay half buried in needles. The view from there looked back down the mountain toward the distant scatter of lights that was the town. Silas stopped and used his sleeve to brush the pine needles from a section of the log. The same way he had moved her chair closer to the fire earlier. When the wood was clear, he waited until she sat before he lowered himself beside her, leaving a careful space between them. Lydia held the mug in both hands and let the last of its warmth seep into her fingers. She looked at the torn hem where it lay across her knee. In the lantern light, the frayed edge looked silver. She traced it once vekepite hot her fingertip, and thought of the platform, of the laughter, of the letter still unopened on the mantel. She thought of the rider's voice repeating the pastoress' refusal, and the town's agreement. The cruel joke her family had played had traveled faster than the stagecoach. It had arrived before her, and was already shaping the story the valley wanted to tell about her. Yet the man sitting beside her on the log had read every word of that joke, and still lifted her onto the wagon seat. He had stood in his own doorway and sent the rider back down the mountain without raising his voice. He had replaced her shawl when it slipped and poured coffee into the better mug and brushed pine needles from a place for her to sit. The joke had been meant to end with her being turned away. Instead, it had brought her here, to a clearing where the only voices were the wind in the high branches and the quiet breathing of the man who had chosen her anyway. She turned her head to look at him. The lantern light caught the edge of his profile and the gray in his beard. He was watching the distant lights of the town, not her scar. "Do you regret claiming me when you saw what they had written?" she asked. The question came out smaller than she had meant it to. She kept her eyes on the torn hem, so she would not have to see his face change if the answer was yes. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough but certain. Regret is for men who never had to choose between what is easy and what is right. Mort chose right the moment. Mort saw you step down from that coach. The scar did not change it. The letter did not change it. The rider did not change it. She felt the words settle inside her the way the coffee had settled earlier. Warm and real, and harder to disbelieve than she had expected. The joke her family had played had been meant to break her, or to break him. Instead, it had brought her to a place where a giant of a man brushed pine needles from a log so she could sit, without getting her dress dirty. It had brought her to a man who stood between her and every new cruelty, without ever asking her to earn the protection. The wind moved through the pines above them, a sound like the sea she had never seen. She let the sound fill the space where fear had been. For the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped, she allowed herself to wonder whether the cruel joke might be turning into something else entirely. Something the fire had not touched and the town could not take away. Silas shifted on the log so he could face her more fully. The lantern between them threw soft light on both their faces. He looked at her directly, the storm-gray eyes steady in the way they had been on the platform. "If the pastor will not bless what we choose," he said, "there are other ways to make it real. The mountains do not need a church door or a man in a robe to witness a vow. But it will not be easy. The town will say Moat took you without blessing. They will say you are not a wife, but something less. They will make certain every door that might have opened to you stays closed." He paused. The wind found the clearing and moved the lantern flame. Lydia felt the cold air on her face and the warmth of the shawl still on her shoulders. She thought of the rideress' words, and the letter on the mantel, and the way Silas had filled the doorway, like a wall no one had dared to push against. She met his eyes. "And if Mott choose the mountains instead of the church?" she asked. "Will you still stand between me and them when they come to make sure the joke wins?" Silas did not look away. Moat already have. He reached across the small space between them and covered her hand, and tri-space where it rested on the torn hem. His palm was rough and warm and steady. He did not squeeze. He simply held it there for a breath, the way he had steadied her elbow when she stepped down from the stagecoach. Then he released her and stood. "The rider was only the first," he said, his voice low again. "The pastor is coming himself tomorrow with witnesses. They mean to stand on this mountain and make certain everyone hears that no blessing will ever be given. They mean to finish what your family started." He picked up the lantern. The light swung gently as he turned back toward the trail that wound down to the cabin. Lydia rose and followed. The pine needles crunched under her boots. The torn hem of her dress brushed against the low branches. Ahead of her, Silas's broad back blocked the wind. Behind them, on the lower road where the rider had disappeared, a new light had appeared, smaller than the first, moving slowly upward. It stopped where the trail met the main road and stayed there, waiting. Lydia stopped walking. The wind moved the tops of the pines and carried the faint sound of voices from the place where the new light waited. Silas turned back to her, the lantern raised so she could see his face clearly. In the shifting light, his eyes were the color of storm clouds that had finally decided to break. "They are not coming for me," he said. "They are coming for the joke they think they can still finish. The question is no longer whether Mort will stand between you and them." He looked down the mountain toward the waiting light. "The question is whether you will let me keep standing there when the cost stops being words and starts being everything else they can take." The lantern flame trembled in the wind. The voices from the lower road grew no louder, but they did not go away. Lydia stood on the winding trail between the thick pines. The torn hem of her dress caught on a low branch and felt the full weight of the choice he had placed in her hands. The cruel joke her family had begun had reached this mountain. The man who had claimed her without hesitation was offering to finish it with her, or to let it finish them both. The light below waited, the wind waited, and Lydia, for the first time since the fire, felt the story that had been written about her begin to bend toward something she might still have the power to rewrite. They turned back down the trail together. The pine needles no longer crunched as loudly under their boots. The wind had dropped to a low, steady breath that moved only the highest branches. Lydia kept one hand lightly on the shawl at her shoulder, and the other near the torn hem of her dress so it would not catch again on the low brush. Silas walked ahead with the lantern, its circle of light rocking gently vacapite each step. He did not speak. She did not need him to. The weight of the choice he had given her sat between them like a third presence on the narrow path. But it did not feel heavy in the way the rider's words had felt heavy. It felt like something she could hold without it cutting her. When they reached the cabin, the light that had waited on the lower road was gone. Only the dark shape of the trees and the faint glow from the cabin window remained. Silas opened the door and stepped inside first, the way he had done at the platform and at the porch. He set the lantern on the table and moved straight to the hearth. The fire had burned low while they were gone. He added 2 new logs, adjusted the draft with the poker, and waited until the flames caught and rose before he turned back to her. "Sit," he said. The word was short, but the tone had changed. It was no longer an order given to protect. It was an invitation, given because she belonged in the chair now. Lydia sat. The chair he had moved closer to the fire earlier was still there. The wool shawl slipped from her shoulder again as she settled, and before she could reach for it, Silas was already lifting it. He draped it back into place with the same careful touch he had used on the trail and on the wagon. His fingers brushed the edge of her collarbone for the briefest moment, then withdrew. He crossed to the pot that still hung over the renewed fire, poured fresh coffee into the 2 chipped mugs, and set the one with the smaller chip in front of her. The steam rose between them again, carrying the same dark, bitter scent that had first welcomed her to this room. She wrapped her hands around the warm enamel. The heat moved through the thin porcelain into her palms and up her wrists. She had not realized how cold her fingers had become on the trail until the mug reminded her. She lifted it, took a slow sip, and let the taste settle. It was stronger than before, as if he had added a little more of whatever he used to stretch the groundsans. The warmth spread through her chest, the way the shawl had spread across her shoulders, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Silas sat across from her this time. He did not perch on the edge of the chair as he had earlier. His shoulders eased by a fraction, the massive line of them settling into the wood. He held his own mug in one hand and rested the other on the table, fingers loose. The lantern light caught the small scars on the back of that hand and the way the dark hair on his forearm disappeared under the rolled cuff of his shirt. He watched her drink, without staring at the scar on her face. He watched her hands instead, as if he were measuring weather. They had stopped shaking. She set the mug down and traced the rim with one fingertip. The chip on the opposite side was larger than the one he had given her. She wondered how many mornings he had used the worse mug so that the person across from him would have the better one. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had sat across from him at all. "Mott can work," she said after a moment. The words came out steadier than she had expected. "If I stay. If Mott choose the mountains instead of the church. Moat can mend and cook and keep a garden. Moat can preserve what grows here and make sure the cabin does not feel like a place a man only passes through." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee before he answered. When he set the mug down, the chip on his own rim caught the light. "The cabin has needed those things for a long time," he said. "The roof leaks in the far corner when the snow melts. The garden has gone to weeds. The preserves ran out 2 winters ago. Mort have been living like a man who expects to leave again at any moment." He looked at her directly then, the storm-gray eyes open in a way they had not been on the platform. "If you stay, you will not be a guest. You will be the one who decides Cape Hatate this place becomes." The words landed softly but deeply. Lydia felt them settle in the same place the coffee and the shawl and the brushed pine needles had settled, somewhere behind her ribs where fear had lived for so long that she had forgotten Cape Hatate anything else felt like. She thought of the stagecoach, and the laughter, and the letter on the mantel. She thought of the rider's voice, and the light that had waited on the road. All of it had been meant to make her small again, to finish the joke her family had begun when they locked the door and struck the match. Instead, she was sitting in a chair that had been moved closer to the fire, holding a mug that had been chosen for her, being told that the cabin could become something, because she was willing to work inside it. She looked at the torn hem of her dress, where it lay across her lap. The fabric was soft from travel, and from her own fingers worrying it. She smoothed it flat against her knee. "Mort can start with this," she said. "If you have thread and a needle. Mott can mend the hem properly before morning. It will not be perfect, but it will hold." Silas nodded once. The small movement carried more weight than most men's long speeches. He rose, crossed to a small trunk against the wall, and returned with a wooden spool of dark thread and a needle already threaded. He set them on the table beside her mug without comment, then sat again. This time he did not pick up his coffee. He simply rested Beote hot hands on the table and waited, giving her the space to begin if she wanted to or to sit with the warmth, a little longer if she did not. Lydia picked up the needle. The thread was coarse but strong. She folded the torn edge of the hem twice, the way she had been taught years ago before the fire had taken the house and the lessons with it. The needle moved through the fabric in small, even stitches. Each pull of the thread made a soft sound against the quiet of the cabin. The fire popped. The wind outside had gone still. For a little while, the only movement in the room was the rise and fall of her hands and the slow breathing of the man across from her. She did not look up when she spoke again. Tomorrow, when they come, Mott will stand with you. Not because Mott owe you for taking me from the platform. Because the cabin already feels more like a place I belong than any place Mott have been since the fire. And because the joke they tried to finish tonight did not finish me. Silas was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was rougher than it had been on the trail. Your brother wrote one more line in the letter, he said. He said if Mott kept you, the fire you survived would follow you here and take everything Mott have left. Lydia's needle paused halfway through a stitch. She lifted her eyes to his face. The storm gray had gone darker again, the way it had when the rider stood on the porch. What do you have left? She asked. Silas looked at the fire instead of at her. The flames threw moving light across the strong line of his jaw and the gray in his beard. For the first time since she had met him, he seemed to be choosing his words. They kept a hot care, as if the answer mattered more than any answer he had given on the platform or on the trail. Mott have the cabin, he said at last. Mott have the mountain, and Mott have a boy, my brother's son, who comes here when the town gets too loud for him. He is 8. He has been staying with a neighbor down the valley these last weeks, 'cause Mott did not know if Mott would be bringing a stranger home. He turned his head then and met her eyes. If you stay, the fire your brother warned about will not only threaten what Mott have, it will threaten him as well. The needle slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the table. Lydia stared at it for a moment, the dark thread still looped through the eye. She thought of the clearing where they had sat, of the vow he had offered without a church, of the light that had waited on the road. She thought of an 8-year-old boy who already knew what it was to need a place quieter than the town. She thought of the chipped mug in front of her, and the way Silas had always given her the better one. She picked up the needle again and finished the stitch she had begun. The hem lay smoother now against her knee. When she looked up, Silas was still watching her, waiting for the answer she had not yet given. Outside, the wind had returned. It moved around the cabin like a question that had not decided whether to knock. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the lantern threw its small circle of light across the table where 2 chipped mugs sat cooling, and a needle moved through torn fabric that was slowly becoming whole again. Lydia held the needle in one hand and the edge of the mended hem in the other, and felt the full weight of the choice he had placed in her hands shift once more. This time towards something that looked less like survival and more like the beginning of work that might, if she was brave enough to keep choosing it, become something like love. She finished the last stitch and tied the knot with a small, careful tug. The torn hem now lay flat against her knee, the frayed edge hidden inside a neat row of dark thread. Lydia ran her thumb along the repair once, feeling the strength of it under her fingertip. It was not perfect, it would hold. She set the needle and spool on the table beside the cooling mug and looked up. Silas had not moved. He still sat across from her, both hands resting on the table, the storm-gray eyes watching the way her hands had worked rather than the scar on her face. When she met his gaze, he gave a single, small nod. The movement was barely there, just the lowering and lifting of his chin, but it carried more weight than any words he had spoken on the platform or the trail. It was the first time she had seen approval on his face since he had claimed her in front of the town. She stood. The chair scraped softly against the floorboards. The cabin felt smaller now that she had decided to move inside it instead of simply passing through. She crossed to the hearth where the fire burned steady and warm, then turned slowly, taking in the room the way a woman takes in a place she might be asked to keep. The roof beam in the far corner showed a dark stain where water had come through in the spring. The shelves above the table held a few tins and a cloth sack that sagged in the middle. A bundle of dried herbs hung from a nail near the window, the leaves brittle but still fragrant when she brushed them with her fingers. Silas rose without being asked. He moved to the trunk against the wall, lifted the lid, and brought out a small iron pot and a wooden spoon. He set them on the table near her, then returned to his chair. Another nod, smaller this time, as if he were giving her permission to begin, rather than telling her what to do. Lydia opened the sack. Inside were strips of dried venison, a few small onions that had begun to sprout, and a handful of wrinkled root vegetables she recognized as turnips. She found a knife in a drawer and began to work. The sound of the blade against the wooden board was quiet and rhythmic. She cut the venison into small pieces, the onions into thin half-moons, the turnips into chunks that would soften in the pot. The dried herbs she crumbled between her palms and set aside. Every motion was one she had done 100 times before the fire, before the locked door, before the letter that had turned her into a joke. Her hands remembered even when her mind had tried to forget. She set the pot on the hook over the fire and added a little water from the bucket near the door. The first bubbles rose slowly. She stirred with the wooden spoon, the motion slow, and even the way her mother had taught her so the bottom would not scorch. The smell of the venison softening and the onions releasing their sweetness began to fill the cabin. It mixed with the pine smoke and the sharper scent of the herbs she added last. The stew would not be rich. It would be enough. Silas watched from his chair. He had picked up his mug again, but did not drink from it. His eyes followed the spoon as it moved through the pot, then lifted to her face when she turned to reach for the salt tin. When she caught him looking, he did not glance away. He gave the same small nod he had given when she finished the hen. The approval was quiet, almost private, as if he were afraid that speaking it aloud would break something fragile that had just begun to form between them. Lydia felt the nod settle inside her, the same way the warmth of the mug had settled earlier. For years her hands had been useful only for surviving, climbing from windows, clutching shawls, tracing scars in the dark. Now they were doing the oldest work she knew. And the man across the room was watching as if the work mattered. As if she mattered. The joke her family had played had been meant to make her small enough to nail away and forget. Instead, she was standing at a hearth that was not hers yet, stirring a pot that would feed the man who had chosen her anyway, and the simple act of stirring felt like the first real choice she had made since the stagecoach wheels stopped turning. She stirred again, slower this time, and let the steam rise into her face. The heat loosened something tight behind her eyes. She thought of the clearing where they had sat, of the vow he had offered without a church, of the boy he had mentioned only in passing, an 8-year-old who already knew what it was to need quiet. She thought of the light that had waited on the road, and the pastor who would come tomorrow with witnesses to finish what her family had started. All of it still waited outside the cabin walls. Inside, the only sounds were the spoon against the iron pot and the low crackle of the fire, and the steady breathing of the man who had given her the better mug, and the nod that asked for nothing in return. Silas stood. He crossed the bucket, poured a little water into a small bowl, and brought it to the table with a clean cloth. He set Bayote hot beside her without a word. She understood. She rinsed her hands, the water cold and clean, and dried them on the cloth. When she turned back to the pot, he had already moved the lantern closer so the light would fall across her work without casting shadows on the spoon. Another small act of care. Another warmth that did not ask to be named. She tasted the broth with the edge of the spoon, added a pinch more of the crumbled herbs, and stirred once more. The smell had deepened into something that would stick to the walls and the clothes and the memory of this night. When the turnips were soft and the venison had given up its last resistance, she lifted the pot from the hook and set it on the table. Steam rose between them like a curtain that hid nothing and protected everything. Silas brought 2 bowls from the shelf. He filled hers first, using the spoon to make sure she had more of the meat and fewer of the turnips. He set the bowl in front of her, then filled his own. He did not sit until she had taken the first bite. The stew was simple and hot and tasted of the mountain and of hands that had chosen to stay. She ate slowly. He ate the same way, the spoon moving quietly, his eyes on the fire more than on the food. When the bowls were empty, Lydia stood to clear them. Silas did not stop her. He only watched the way she moved around the table and the hearth as if she had already begun to belong there. She washed the bowls in the same water she had used for her hands, set them on the shelf to dry, and wiped the table with the cloth. Every motion was small. Every motion was hers. When she turned back, Silas was still in his chair, but his shoulders had eased further. The storm-gray eyes held something she had not seen on the platform, or the trail, or even in the clearing. It looked like the beginning of trust. She sat again. The mended hem of her dress brushed the floor. The fire had settled into a steady glow. Outside, the wind had gone quiet. For a little while, the cabin held only the two of them and the smell of the stew and the warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. Silas spoke first. His voice was low, almost rough from the long silence. The boy's name is Elias. He is 8, my brother's son. His mother died the winter before last. The town says it was the fever. My brother says it was the way they looked at her after she married a man who lived too high on the mountain. He paused. The fire popped once. He comes here when the looks get too heavy. Mott have been sending him to the neighbor's, because Mott did not know what Mott was bringing home. Lydia nodded. She understood the weight of a name that carried more than itself. She understood the way a town could decide a person was a burden before they ever had the chance to prove otherwise. "Will he come tomorrow?" she asked. Silas looked at the fire instead of at her. The neighbor was to bring him at first light. But if the pastor comes with witnesses, it may be better if the boy stays away until it is finished. She heard what he did not say. The pastor and the town would not only refuse a blessing, they would make certain. The refusal reached every ear, including an 8-year-old boy who already knew what it was to be looked at sideways. The joke her family had begun had grown larger than the letter on the mantel. It had grown large enough to touch a child who had never met her. Lydia stood and crossed to the hearth. She added one more small log, the way she had seen Silas do, and used the poker to settle the burning pieces so the flames would last until morning. When she turned back, Silas was watching her again. The nod he gave this time was slower, almost private, as if the simple act of tending the fire had answered a question he had not yet asked aloud. She returned to her chair. The mended hem settled around her boots. The chipped mug sat empty on the table between them. Outside, the wind had begun to move again, but it did not knock. It only circled the cabin, like a question that had not yet decided whether it would wait for an answer or come inside and demand one. Silas rose. He crossed to the door, opened it a crack, and stood for a long moment with his hand on the frame. When he closed it again, the latch clicked with the same final sound it had made when the rider left. He turned back to her, the storm-gray eyes steady in the lantern light. "The neighbor will bring the boy at first light, whether the pastor comes or not," he said. "Elias has already lost one home. Moat will not let him lose another because your family decided to finish a joke on my mountain." He did not ask if she was still willing to stay. He did not need to. The answer was in the mended hem, in the empty stew pot, in the way she had tended the fire without being asked. But when he spoke again, his voice carried a new edge, low and final. "Your brother wrote that the fire would follow you here and take everything Mott have left." He did not know that everything Mott have left is already standing in this room, stirring a pot and mending a dress and choosing to stay, even though the town is coming to tell you that you should not. He looked at her directly. "Tomorrow, they will try to finish the joke in front of the boy. The question is no longer whether Mort will stand between you and them." He paused, the firelight catching the gray in his beard. "The question is whether you are willing to let an 8-year-old boy watch you choose the mountains instead of the church, knowing that the town will make him pay for that choice long after we are gone. The wind outside found the door and pushed against it. The latch held. Lydia stood very still beside the table, the mended hem of her dress brushing the clean floorboards. The smell of the stew still clinging to the air between them. She thought of the clearing and the vow, and the light that had waited on the road. She thought of an 8-year-old boy who already knew the weight of sideways looks, and she thought of the man who had given her the better mug and the nod and the space to work, now asking her to decide how much of his quiet world she was willing to risk for the chance to finish the joke on her own terms. The fire popped once, sharp and loud. Outside, the wind circled again, and Lydia, for the first time since the stagecoach had carried her up the mountain, understood that the cruel joke her family had begun had never been only about her. It had always been about who would be left standing when the laughter finally stopped. The wind had circled the cabin once more, and then gone still when the first gray light touched the single window. Lydia had not slept. She had sat in the chair by the fire while Silas dozed upright across from her, his massive frame somehow managing to look both relaxed and ready even in sleep. The mended hem of her dress lay smooth across her knee. The stew pot had been emptied and scrubbed, and set back on the shelf. The chipped mugs rested side by side, clean and waiting for whatever the new day would bring. She rose quietly and added a small log to the fire, so the cabin would be warm when the boy arrived. The neighbor was to bring him at first light. Silas had said so. Lydia found herself listening for the sound of hooves or small feet on the path, her hands already moving to the pot as if she could prepare something before the child even stepped through the door. She told herself it was only practical. The boy would be cold from the walk. He would be hungry. These were simple things, not the beginning of something that could break her if it was taken away. The knock came softly. 3 small raps that barely carried through the logs. Not the firm sound of the rider or the heavy tread of a man. Lydia crossed to the door before Silas had fully risen. She opened it to the gray morning and the thin figure standing on the porch. He was 8, small for his age, with dark hair that stuck up in the back the way children's hair does after sleep or travel. His coat was too thin for the mountain cold, and his cheeks were red from the wind. He clutched a small bundle against his chest and looked up at her hot eyes that were too old for his face. They were the same storm gray as Silas, but they held a wariness that Lydia recognized at once. She had seen it in her own mirror after the fire. She had seen it in the faces of the people who had watched her descend from the stagecoach. It was the look of someone who had already learned that the world could decide. You were a burden before you ever opened your mouth. Uncle Silas, the boy asked, his voice small and careful. Mr. Harlan said Moot should come early. He said the pastor is already on the road with 2 men from town. He said they re coming to tell you to send the lady away. Lydia felt the words land like cold water against her skin. She stepped back without thinking and opened the door wider. The boy hesitated only a moment before he stepped inside, bringing the smell of cold pine and damp wool and the faint metallic tang of fierce sweat with him. Silas was already on his feet, crossing the room in 2 strides. He knelt in front of the child so their eyes were level, his massive hands resting lightly on the boy's thin shoulders. Elias, he said, the name rough but gentle. You safe here? The boy nodded, but his eyes had already moved past his uncle to Lydia. He studied the scar along her cheek, the way children study things they have been told are dangerous. Then he looked at the mended hem of her dress, and the way she stood with one hand still on the door, as if she might need to close it quickly. Are you the lady from the fire? He asked. The question was not cruel. It was simply the way an 8-year-old says the thing that has been weighing on him. Lydia felt her breath catch. She had prepared herself for the pastor and the witnesses and the town's cruelty. She had not prepared herself for this small voice, asking the question her own family had turned into a joke. Silas started to answer, but Lydia spoke first. Her voice came out quieter than she had intended. "Motem, the lady from the fire," she said. "But the fire is over. It does not live here." The boy considered this for a moment. Then he stepped closer to her, still clutching his small bundle. He reached out one cold hand and touched the edge of her mended hem where the new stitches showed dark against the faded blue. "Mr. Harlan said the town is going to make you leave," he said. "He said, the pastor is going to tell Uncle Silas that keeping you will bring the fire back. Is that true?" Lydia looked at Silas. He had risen but had not moved closer, giving her the space to answer or to step back. His storm-gray eyes held the same steady question the boy had asked, only quieter. She thought of the clearing and the vow, and the way Silas had given her, the better mug, and the nod that asked for nothing. She thought of the stew she had stirred, and the hem she had mended, and the way the cabin had begun to feel like a place her hands could belong. She thought of the light that had waited on the road, and the voices that would come with the morning. She knelt in front of the boy so they were eye to eye, the way Silas had done. The movement made the mended hem pool around her boots again. She reached for the thin coat he wore and began to unbutton it with careful fingers. The fabric was cold and damp from the walk. Underneath, he wore a shirt that had been mended more than once, the stitches uneven but strong. "The town can say what it wants," she answered. "The fire does not decide who stays and who goes. Not anymore." She slipped the coat from his shoulders and draped it over the back of the chair near the fire. Then she took the blanket Silas had used earlier and wrapped it around the boy's thin frame. The wool was heavy and warm, and smelled of pine and wood smoke. She tucked the edge under his chin the way she had once tucked blankets around herself, when the nights after the fire had been too long. The boy did not pull away. He leaned into the warmth, the way a small animal leans into shelter it has not yet learned to distrust. Silas moved to the hearth. He lifted the stew pot, poured what remained into the better bowl, and set it on the table. He did not speak. He only gave the same small nod he had given Lydia when she finished the hem and when she stirred the stew. The nod that said the work mattered. The nod that said she was already doing the thing he had hoped she would do. Lydia guided the boy to the chair. She pulled it closer to the fire the way Silas had once pulled her chair closer. She set the bowl in front of him and found a spoon. The boy ate slowly at first, then faster when the warmth reached him. She stood beside the table and watched the way his small hands held the spoon, the way his shoulders eased under the blanket with each bite. She thought of her own lost childhood, of the nights she had eaten alone after the fire, because no one wanted to sit across from the girl whose face told the story her family had written. She thought of how easy it would be to keep her heart closed, to do only what was necessary until the pastor came and the choice was taken from her. She thought of how much safer it would feel to remain the woman who had been mailed here as a joke, rather than the woman who might become something more to an 8-year-old boy who already knew what it was to be sent away. Her hands moved without her telling them to. She found the cloth she had used to wipe the table earlier and dampened it in the bucket. She knelt again beside the boy and wiped a smudge of stew from the corner of his mouth. The touch was gentle. The boy did not flinch. He looked at her those old eyes, and gave her the smallest smile she had seen since the stagecoach stopped. "You cook like my mother used to," he said, "before she got sick." The words were simple. They landed in the quiet space between Lydia's ribs, where she had kept the fear of opening her heart again. She felt the reluctant compassion stir and then settle into something warmer, something that did not ask her to finish before it took root. She smoothed the blanket over his shoulders one more time and stood. Silas had not moved from his place by the hearth. He watched her, with the same steady gaze he had used on the platform when he claimed her and on the trail when he offered the mountain vow. The nod he gave her now was slower, deeper, as if he had seen the moment she chose to reach for the boy instead of stepping back. Outside, the gray light had strengthened. The wind had not returned, but in the distance, down the mountain road, the sound of horses and voices carried clearly through the thin morning air. Not one rider this time. Not the single light that had waited in the dark. Multiple horses. Multiple men. The pastor and his witnesses were coming earlier than anyone had expected, and they were coming with the full weight of the town behind them. Lydia stood between the table and the fire, the mended hem of her dress brushing the floorboards, the boy eating stew under the blanket she had wrapped around him, and felt the full weight of the choice she had made when she opened the door. The cruel joke her family had begun had reached this mountain, and this child, the man who had claimed her without hesitation, was watching her capite. Hot. Eyes that already knew what she was about to ask. She looked at Silas. Her voice was quiet but steady. Will they take him if not stay? Silas did not lie. He never had. They will try, he said. They will say a scarred woman and an orphaned boy under the same roof is proof that the fire followed you here. They will say Mort am choosing ruin over the town's blessing. He paused. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder. The question is no longer whether Mort will stand between you and them. The question is whether you are willing to let an 8-year-old boy watch you choose the mountains, knowing that the town will make him carry the cost of that choice for the rest of his life. The boy had stopped eating. He looked from Lydia to Silas and back again, the spoon still in his small hand. Outside, the horses had reached the yard. Boots hit the ground. Voices spoke in low, urgent tones. The knock that came next was not small. It was the sound of men who believed they had the right to finish what someone else had started. Lydia looked at the boy wrapped in the blanket she had given him. She looked at the mended hem and the empty stew bowl and the chipped mug she had used the night before. She thought of the clearing and the vow, and the way Silas had given her the better of everything without ever asking her to earn it. She thought of the fire that had taken her family, and the letter that had tried to take her future, and the small hand that had touched her hem without fear. She turned to the door. Her hand found the latch. She did not open it yet. She looked back at Silas, the storm-gray eyes steady, waiting for the answer she had not yet spoken aloud. Moat will not let them finish the joke in front of him, she said. Not today. Not while Mort am still standing. The knock came again. Louder. The voices outside grew clearer. And Lydia, with the mended hem of her dress and the boy watching from the chair by the fire, reached for the latch capite hot hands that no longer trembled. The latch lifted under Lydia's hand with a soft metallic sound. The door opened to gray morning light and the 3 men standing in the yard. The pastor stood in the center, an older man with a face that had practiced righteousness until it no longer needed to feel it. On either side of him stood 2 townsmen Lydia recognized from the platform, the ones who had laughed loudest when she stepped down from the stagecoach. Their horses stamped and blew in the cold. The smell of leather, sweat, and something sour like old tobacco drifted up to the porch. The pastor's eyes went straight to the scar on her cheek, then to the boy wrapped in the blanket behind her. His mouth tightened into a line of practiced disapproval. We have come to save you from a mistake that will ruin more than your own name, Silas, he said. His voice carried the tone of a man who believed God agreed with him. The woman is a joke sent by her own blood. Her scar is the mark of the fire she survived because someone decided she should not. No pastor in this valley will ever bless a union built on cruelty and mockery. Send her away today. The boy does not need to grow up watching his uncle choose ruin over the town's protection. One of the townsmen spat into the dirt. We heard what her family wrote. They said she brings fire wherever she goes. You think the town will stand by while an orphaned child is put in danger because you took a scarred woman as some kind of mercy project? Silas filled the doorway completely. His shoulders blocked most of the light. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply stood there, the storm-gray eyes flat and final, and let the silence stretch until the horses shifted uneasily. "The choice is mine," he said. The words were low, but carried across the yard like the first rumble before thunder. "The boy stays. She stays. You will not speak of her that way on my land or in front of my nephew. Go back to the valley. Tell the town what you have seen here. Moat will come down for supplies before noon. We can settle the rest then." The pastoress' face darkened. "You are choosing the joke over the boy's future. The town will not forget this." "Moat have forgotten worse things," Silas answered. "Leave. Now." The two townsmen looked at each other. The pastor opened his mouth as if to speak again, then closed it. He turned without another word. The horses wheeled. The sound of their departure faded down the mountain road. Only the thin morning light and the smell of cold pine remained. Silas closed the door. The latch clicked into place. He turned to Lydia and the boy. His jaw was already tight, the muscle along it working once before he spoke. "Moat need to go to town for supplies," he said. "Flour, thread, salt. And Mott need to hear what else they are saying before it reaches this door." He looked at the boy, then back at Lydia. "Elias stays here. With you. The neighbor will not take him back while the rumors are this loud." Lydia nodded. She had already wrapped the blanket tighter around the boy's shoulders. The child had not spoken since the door opened. He watched Silas with the same old eyes that had studied her scar. Silas crossed to the boy and placed one large hand gently on top of his dark hair. The touch was brief, steady, the way a man touches something he has sworn to protect. "Mind Lydia while Moat'am gone. She cooks better than Mort do. And she mends things that need mending." The boy nodded. Silas turned to Lydia. For a moment he simply looked at her. The mended hem, the way she stood between the boy and the door, the quiet that had settled in her face since she opened the latch. He gave the same small nod he had given when she finished the hem and when she stirred the stew. "Lock the door after I leave," he said. "Do not open it for anyone but me." He took his heavy wool coat from the peg, shrugged it on, and stepped back into the gray morning. The wagon creaked as he climbed up. The sound of the wheels on the stony path faded quickly. Lydia stood at the window and watched until the wagon disappeared around the first bend. Then she turned the lock and drew the simple bolt Silas had shown her the night before. The cabin felt larger and quieter without him. The boy sat at the table, still wrapped in the blanket, the empty stew bowl in front of him. Lydia moved to the hearth and added another log even though the fire did not need it. She stirred the embers the way she had seen Silas do, letting the small task keep her hands busy while her mind worked through what the pastor had said. The cruel words had not reached the boy directly, but they had come close enough for him to hear the shape of them. She thought of the clearing and the vow Silas had offered. She thought of the mended hem and the stew, and the way her hands had already begun to claim small pieces of this cabin. The joke her family had begun had grown teeth. It was no longer only about her scar or her shame. It was about an 8-year-old boy who had already lost too much and was now being told that the woman who had fed him might be the reason he lost more. She found the spool of thread and the needle where she had left them. She sat across from the boy and picked up a corner of the blanket where the edge had begun to fray. The stitches she made were small and even. The boy watched her hands the way he had watched the spoon the night before. "Does it hurt?" he asked after a while. His voice was small in the quiet cabin. "The scar. When people look at it, Lydia did not stop stitching. She kept her eyes on the thread. It used to, Sen. Now it mostly feels like a reminder that Moot survived something that tried to finish me. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, my mother had a scar on her hand from the stove. She said it meant she was brave enough to cook, even when the fire was hot. Is your scar like that? Lydia felt something loosen behind her ribs. She looked up and met the boyish storm-gray eyes. Something like that, she answered. She finished the small repair on the blanket and set the needle down. The boy had begun to lean forward on his elbows, the blanket slipping from one shoulder. She reached across the table and tucked it back into place. The motion was automatic. It felt like something her hands had been waiting to do for years. They sat in the quiet for a long while. Lydia told the boy a story about a girl who learned to mend torn things so well that even the wind could not find the holes anymore. The boy listened without interrupting. When the story ended, he asked if she could teach him to stitch a straight line. She said yes. She showed him how to hold the needle, how to pull the thread without tangling it. His small fingers were clumsy at first, but he did not give up. Each time he managed a few even stitches, she gave him the same small nod Silas had given her. The boy's face lit with something that looked dangerously close to trust. The sound of the wagon returning came in the middle of the afternoon. Lydia had kept the fire built and the door locked. She had fed the boy the last of the bread, with a little of the stew broth warmed again. When the wheels stopped in the yard, she stood and moved to the window. Silas climbed down from the wagon. His jaw was set in the same tight line it had held when he left. He carried 2 sacks and a small wrapped bundle. He did not look back down the mountain road. He came straight to the door. Lydia opened it before he knocked. He stepped inside, bringing the cold air and the smell of the town with him. He set the sacks on the table and the small bundle beside them. Then he turned to her. The storm-gray eyes were darker than they had been that morning. The rumors are worse than the pastor let on, he said. His voice was low, meant for her ears only, even though the boy was watching from the table. They are saying you were sent here to trap me. That the scar is a curse and the boy will catch it if he stays. Some are saying Mott have been bewitched by a sad story and a pretty face that hides something ugly. The pastor is calling a gathering at the church in 2 days. He wants the whole valley to decide what should be done about the scarred woman's and the orphan on the mountain. He did not soften the words. He never had. Lydia felt them land, but they did not cut as deeply as they once would have. She had spent the day mending a blanket and teaching a boy to stitch and telling stories that made him lean closer instead of pulling away. The poison was out there. It had not seeped into the cabin. Silas crossed to the hearth and added a log without being asked. The flames rose. He turned back and draped his heavy wool coat over her shoulders, the way he had done on the wagon and on the trail. The weight settled around her like an extra wall. He adjusted the collar once with 2 fingers, the same careful touch he had used every time. Then he picked up the small wrapped bundle and set it in front of the boy. Inside was a piece of hard candy wrapped in paper and a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than the boy's palm. The boy's eyes widened. He looked at Silas, then at Lydia, then back at the candy as if he were afraid it might disappear. For being brave this morning, Silas said. The nod he gave the boy was the same one he had given Lydia when she finished the hem. Lydia watched the boy's small hands close around the candy and the horse. She watched Silas move around the cabin, putting away the flour and the thread and the salt, as if this were any ordinary day and the valley below were not sharpening its knives. She thought of the platform, and the rider and the pastor's the cruel words, and the way Silas had stood in the doorway, like a mountain that would not be moved. The joke her family had begun had tried to finish her. It had tried to finish the boy. Instead, it had brought her here, to a cabin where a giant of a man protected what was his with silence and small, steady acts and a jaw that stayed tight, so the poison would not reach the people inside. Silas finished putting the supplies away. He turned to her. The firelight caught the gray in his beard, and the lines around his eyes that had deepened since morning. "The gathering is in 2 days," he said. "They will expect us to come or to hide. Either way, they mean to make certain the valley sees the joke finished in public." He paused. The wind outside had returned, circling the cabin again. "Mort will not let them take the boy. Mort will not let them finish what your family started in front of him. But the cost is rising. They are already saying that if Mort keep you, the boy should be removed for his own safety." Lydia felt the words settle. She looked at the boy, who was carefully unwrapping the candy, with fingers still clumsy from the stitching lesson. She looked at the mended blanket on the chair, and the empty stew bowl, and the coat that now rested on her shoulders. She thought of the clearing, and the vow, and the way Silas had asked her if she was willing to let the boy watch her choose the mountains. She met Silas's storm-gray eyes across the small space between them. "Then we go to the gathering," she said. "Not to hide. Not to beg. To finish the joke ourselves." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. The nod he gave her this time was slower, deeper, as if something final had been decided between them. Outside, the wind found the door and pushed against it. The latch held. Inside, the fire burned steady, and the boy ate his candy, and the cabin held the three of them like a secret the valley had not yet managed to take. But when Silas turned to bank the fire for the night, Lydia saw the way his shoulders had not eased even after the supplies were put away. She saw the tightness that remained in his jaw, and she understood that the protection he offered was real and strong, but it was no longer enough to keep the poison from eventually finding a way through. The gathering in 2 days would not be the end. It would only be the place where the town tried to finish what her family had begun, and where she would have to decide how much of herself she was willing to risk so that an 8-year-old boy would not have to carry the cost of a joke he had never asked to hear. The morning after Silas returned with the news of the gathering, the sky over the mountain was clear and cold. Lydia woke to the sound of the boy moving quietly near the hearth, trying not to wake her. She had slept on the narrow bunk, while Silas had taken the chair by the fire again, his massive frame somehow fitting into the space, without complaint. The mended hem of her dress lay smooth across the blanket, the small piece of needlework she had begun the night before. Simple stitches forming the outline of a pine branch rested on the table beside the spool of thread Silas had brought from town. She rose and dressed quickly. The cabin already smelled of the coffee Silas had started. He stood at the hearth, pouring the dark liquid into the 2 chipped mugs. He gave her the one with the smaller chip without being asked. The boy sat at the table, the carved wooden horse in one hand, and the piece of candy still carefully saved in its paper wrapper. "We go to the fair today," Silas said after they had eaten a simple breakfast of the last bread and warmed broth. His voice was low, meant to carry only across the small table. "The gathering is tomorrow at the church. The town will expect us to hide until then. We will not give them that." He looked at Lydia, then at the boy. "You have preserves from the turnips and onions you stretched last night. You have the needlework. Enter them. Let the valley see what you can do with your hands before they hear what the pastor plans to say with his mouth." Lydia nodded. She had not expected to leave the cabin so soon after the pastor's visit, but the logic was clear. Hiding would only feed the rumors showing herself, and what she could make might plant a different story. She packed the 2 small jars of simple preserves she had made from the last of the vegetables and the dried herbs, and the small square of linen where her careful stitches formed a neat border. The boy watched her wrap them in a clean cloth and place them in the basket Silas had brought from town. The wagon ride down the mountain was quieter than the first journey Lydia had taken. The boy sat between them on the seat, wrapped in the mended blanket. Silas drove with steady hands, his jaw no longer quite as tight as it had been the day before. The road wound through pines that opened onto meadows already touched with the gold of early autumn. The air smelled of crushed needles and wood smoke from distant cabins. When they reached the valley floor, the sounds of the fair reached them first. The lowing of cattle, the high calls of vendors selling fried pies and roasted corn. The mountain fair spread across the open ground at the edge of the timber town. Stalls lined the main path. Quilts hung from ropes between trees. Jars of preserves and pickles caught the sunlight on long tables. Children ran between the legs of adults. The smell of hot grease and sweet dough and pine resin mixed in the cool air. Lydia felt the eyes turn toward them as the wagon stopped. Some faces were curious. Some were the same ones that had laughed on the platform. A few nodded at Motfe Silas, with the cautious respect men give a neighbor who has never asked for help, but has always given it when needed. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady at Mot Faf, her waist for the brief moment she needed. He carried the basket to the long table where the homemaking entries were being judged. The woman behind the table was the same one who had spoken loudest on the platform. She looked at Lydia's scar, then at the jars and the stitched square, then at Silas standing behind her like a wall no one had managed to push through. "Turnips and onions," the woman said, not unkindly. "And a border stitch. Simple work. Work that fed us last night and will feed us again," Silas answered. His voice was quiet but carried. Work that mends what is torn instead of throwing it away. The woman nodded once and took the entries. She placed them among the others, fancier jars of berry preserves from women who had more time and more sugar. More elaborate needlework from women who had not spent the last months surviving a fire and a joke. Lydia stepped back. Silas stayed at her side. The boy stood in front of them, one small hand holding the edge of Lydia's mended hem as if it were an anchor. They walked the fair while the judging happened. Silas bought the boy a small piece of fried dough dusted with sugar. He bought Lydia nothing, but when she shivered in a sudden gust of wind, he draped his heavy wool coat over her shoulders again without a word. The weight of it and the smell of pine and leather settled around her like the blanket she had wrapped around the boy. They passed stalls selling leather goods and tinware, and bolts of calico. People stepped aside when Silas walked through. Some greeted him with short nods. Few spoke to Lydia directly, but the whispers that followed them were different from the ones on the platform. These held curiosity more than cruelty. When the judging results were called, Lydia's name was read for the small blue ribbon in the preserves category. Not first place, that went to a woman with 3 jars of wild raspberry and a story about her grandmother's recipe. But second place, a small blue ribbon pinned to a card that said honorable mention, stretched ingredients, steady hands. The woman who had taken the entries earlier handed it to her with another nod, this one almost approving. "Simple work," the woman said again. "But it holds. That matters more than fancy when winter comes." A small ripple of approval moved through the people standing near the table. Not applause, not cheers. Just a few nods and one woman saying loud enough to be heard, "She can do more than bring trouble, it seems." Another voice, a man's, added, "Silas always did know how to pick what lasts." The words were not warm, but they were not the laughter that had met her on the platform. They were something in between, surprised, grudging, but real. Lydia held the ribbon in her hand. The blue was bright against the faded calico of her dress. She looked at Silas. He gave her the same small nod he had given when she finished the hem, and when she stirred the stew, and when she taught the boy to stitch. The nod that said the work mattered. The nod that said she had done something no one had expected her to do. The boy tugged her hand. "You won," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet awe he had used when she told him stories. Just like the girl in the story, who mended the wind. Lydia smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the stagecoach stopped. The ribbon felt light in her hand, but it weighed more than it should have. It was proof that her hands could still make something the valley recognized as useful. It was a small balm on wounds that had been left by her family's betrayal, and the pastor's refusal, and the rumors that had followed her up the mountain. For a moment, standing between Silas and the boy at the edge of the judging table, She allowed herself to feel the shift the ribbon represented. The joke had been meant to make her small enough to mail away. Instead, her simple work had earned a small piece of blue cloth and a few nods that said she might be more than the story her family had written. Silas placed a hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd as they turned to leave the judging area. The touch was light but steady, the way he had steadied her elbow on the platform and on the trail. He did not speak. He did not need to. The ribbon and the nods and the way the boy still held her, said enough for now. They had almost reached the wagon when the pastor's voice carried across the fairground. He stood on a small platform near the church path, surrounded by the same two townsmen who had come to the cabin. His words were loud enough for half the fair to hear. "Even ribbons cannot hide what the fire left," he called. "Even steady hands cannot erase what a family sent as a joke. The gathering is tomorrow at the church. Come and see for yourselves whether a scarred woman and an orphaned boy belong on this mountain, or whether the town must protect what remains of its decency." The fair did not go silent, but the laughter and the calls of vendors quieted in patches. Heads turned. Eyes found Lydia where she stood beside the wagon, the blue ribbon still in her hand, the boy at her side, Silas' coat heavy on her shoulders. The approval that had begun to form around the judging table wavered. Some faces closed again. Some looked away. The ribbon suddenly felt smaller in her fingers. Silas stopped. His body turned slightly so he stood between her and the pastoress platform. The storm-gray eyes were flat, again the jaw tightening once more. He did not shout back. He did not move toward the pastor. He simply stood, massive and unmoving, until the moment passed and the fair sounds slowly returned. Lydia looked down at the boy. He was watching the pastor with the same old eyes that had studied her scar. She tightened her fingers around the ribbon until the edge of the card bit into her palm. The small validation she had earned hat, steady hands, and stretched ingredients had been real. It had been a balm. But the pastor had just reminded the valley that the joke was not finished, and that the boy she had begun to care for might still be asked to pay the price. She looked up at Silas. His hand remained at the small of her back, steady and warm even through the coat. The nod he gave her now was smaller than before, almost private. "We go home," he said. "We prepare for tomorrow. The ribbon stays with you. The town can say what it wants. We have already shown them what your hands can do." Lydia nodded. She slipped the ribbon into the pocket of her dress, where it rested against her hip like a small, secret weight. The wagon creaked as they climbed up. The boy sat between them again, the carved horse in one hand and the edge of her mended hem in the other. As the wagon rolled out of the fairground and back toward the mountain road, Lydia kept one hand in her pocket, fingers tracing the edge of the blue ribbon. The approval had been real. The poison was still waiting, and tomorrow, at the church, she would have to decide whether the small validation she had earned with her hands was enough to stand against everything the pastor and the town planned to take from the boy who now held her hem, as if it were the only thing keeping him from being swept away by the same wind that had once tried to finish her. The wagon had barely reached the yard when the storm found them. It came fast the way mountain storms do, clouds piling over the peaks like dark wool, wind rising in sudden gusts that bent the pines and sent dry needles skittering across the path. By the time Silas set the brake and helped Lydia and the boy down, the first cold rain had begun to fall in heavy drops that struck the wagon canvas like thrown stones. The boy shivered inside the mended blanket. His cheeks, which had been pink from the fair and the candy, had gone pale. Lydia felt the chill in his small hand when she took it to guide him to the door. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low while they were gone. Silas moved straight to it, adding logs and working the draft until the flames caught and rose. Lydia lit the lantern and set it on the table. The boy stood in the center of the room, still wrapped in the blanket, his small frame shaking, hot, a tremor that was not only from the cold. "Sit," she said, guiding him to the chair nearest the hearth. She knelt and pulled off his damp boots, then wrapped the blanket tighter around his shoulders. His skin felt too warm under her fingers. She touched his forehead, the way she had once touched her own after the fire, measuring fever against memory. The heat there was new and wrong. Silas poured water into the pot and set it to heat. He did not ask what she needed. He simply moved around her, bringing the bucket closer, setting the small bundle of dried herbs she had hung near the window within reach. The storm hit the cabin in full now, wind howling around the logs, rain drumming on the roof, the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the dark. The boy coughed once, a dry sound that turned wet at the end. Lydia felt the sound settle in her chest, like a weight she had not known she was carrying. She moved without thinking. The skills were old ones, learned in the months after the fire, when no one would sit vekepite hat her, and she had to keep herself alive with whatever the woods and the ruined garden offered. She crumbled the dried herbs into the heating water, pine needles for the chest, the last of the wild mint for the fever, a pinch of the bitter root she had learned to dry and store, because it eased the kind of cough that settled deep. The steam rose, sharp and green and medicinal. She set the pot on the table near the boy, and draped a clean cloth over his head and the pot so the steam could work on his lungs. "Breathe slow," she told him. Her voice was quiet but steady. In, through the nose. Out through the mouth. The steam will loosen what the cold put in. The boy did as she said. His small shoulders rose and fell under the blanket. Silas stood on the other side of the table, his massive frame casting a shadow that reached the wall. He watched her hands, the way she adjusted the cloth, the way she felt the boy's forehead again, the way she moved to the shelf and found the clean cloths she had washed earlier. When she needed cool water, he brought the bucket without being asked. When the first cloth grew warm against the boy's skin, Silas took it from her and wrung it fresh in the cold water, his large hands careful with the fabric. The night settled into a rhythm of storm and small tasks. Lydia changed the cloths on the boy's forehead and chest, cooling the fever when it rose, and keeping the steam going when his breathing grew tight. She whispered the old remedies her mother had taught her before the fire took the house, and the lessons, words that were half prayer and half memory, spoken more to steady her own hands than to call anything down from the sky. The boy drifted in and out, sometimes opening his eyes to watch her face, sometimes slipping into a restless half-sleep where he murmured about ribbons and dragons, and a girl who mended the wind. Silas stayed awake with her. He did not hover. He simply remained in the cabin, moving when she needed something moved, sitting when she needed the space to work. Once, when her own hands began to shake from tiredness and the memory of another fevered night long ago, he placed one large palm on her shoulder. The weight was steady. It did not demand anything. It only reminded her that she was not alone in the room with the sick child and the storm. Toward the deepest part of the night, the fever peaked. The boy's small chest rose and fell too fast. His skin burned under the cloths. Lydia sat on the floor beside the chair, one hand on his knee, the other holding a fresh, cool cloth to his forehead. She spoke to him in the low voice she had used for the stories. Calm words about pine trees that stood through any wind and blankets that could be mended no matter how torn. She did not know if he heard her. She only knew that the sound of her own voice kept the fear from closing her throat. Silas crouched beside her at one point and offered a cup of the cooled broth she had set aside earlier. She drank without tasting it. When she handed the cup back, he refilled it and set it within reach. Another small act. Another warmth that did not ask to be named. By the time the storm began to ease and the first gray light touched the window, the boy's breathing had slowed. The fever had broken. His skin was damp but cooler. He slept deeply, the carved wooden horse still clutched in one small hand. Lydia sat back on her heels and let out a breath she had been holding since the first cough. Her shoulders ached. Her eyes burned from the steam and the long night. But the boy's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and the terrible tightness in her own chest had loosened with it. She stood slowly. Silas rose with her. He moved to the hearth and added the last log, building the fire back up so the cabin would be warm when the boy woke. Then he turned to her. The storm-gray eyes were tired but clear. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her braid back behind her ear. The same careful touch he had used with the shawl and the coat, and every small thing he had given her since the platform. "You saved him," he said. The words were rough from the long silence. "The town would have said, 'The fire followed you here and took the boy.' Instead, you pulled him thick with herbs and cloths, and staying awake when anyone else would have let the storm have him." Lydia looked at the sleeping child. The blanket she had mended was still wrapped around him. The ribbon from the fair rested on the table where she had set it. Before the fever took hold, she thought of the platform and the Pastor S words, and the way the joke had grown teeth, large enough to reach an 8-year-old boy. She thought of the night she had just lived, the steam and the cloths and the whispered words, and how none of it had felt like the work of a woman who had been nailed here as a cruel punchline. It had felt like the work of hands that belonged to someone who had chosen to stay. She turned back to Silas. Her voice was quiet, but steady. Mott could not have done it alone. He nodded once. The same small nod he had given when she finished the hem, and when she won the ribbon, and when she taught the boy to stitch. Then he crossed to the door and opened it a crack to check the morning. The storm had passed. The pines dripped in the gray light. But in the distance, down the washed-out road, the sound of horses and voices carried again. Louder than before, multiple riders this time, moving with purpose even through the mud and fallen branches. Silas closed the door. The latch clicked. When he turned back to her, the storm-gray eyes had gone flat again. "They are coming early," he said. The storm gave them an excuse. "They will say, 'The boy's illness proves the curse followed you here.' They will say we put him in danger by keeping you. The gathering was set for tomorrow, but they are moving it to today, before noon, so the whole valley can see what happens when a scarred woman and an orphan stay on the mountain together." Lydia felt the words land. She looked at Moff, the boy sleeping under the mended blanket, at the ribbon on the table, at the pot of herbs that had saved him through the night. She thought of the clearing and the vow, and the way Silas had asked if she was willing to let the boy watch her choose the mountains. She had chosen. The night had proven it in ways words never could. She met Silas's eyes across the small space between them. "Then we meet them here," she said. "Not at the church. Here, where the herbs still smell like the night we kept him alive. Let them see what their joke tried to finish and what it could not touch." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the voices and horses grew closer. The wind that had howled through the storm had gone still, but a new kind of storm was already climbing the mountain road. Lydia stood between the sleeping boy and the door, the mended hem of her dress brushing the floorboards, the blue ribbon resting on the table, like a small, bright promise she had earned with her own hands. And for the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped turning, she did not feel like the punchline of someone else's cruel story. She felt like the woman who had stayed awake through the storm and pulled a child back from the edge with nothing more than steady's hands, and the knowledge that some fires can be survived, and some can be fought with nothing but time and care, and the choice to remain, when every voice says you should run. The storm had passed completely by the time the first true sunlight touched the cabin window. The pines outside dripped in the clear morning air, and the road down the mountain showed deep ruts where the rain had carved new paths. Inside, the fire had burned to embers. The pot of herbs still sat on the table, its sharp green scent lingering like a memory of the long night. Lydia woke in the chair where she had finally dozed near dawn. Her neck ached, her eyes felt gritty from steam and sleeplessness. She rose slowly and crossed to the boy. He lay curled under the mended blanket, the carved wooden horse still clutched in one small hand. His breathing was deep and even. When she touched his forehead, the skin was cool. The fever had broken and stayed broken. She let out a breath she had not known she was still holding. She moved quietly to the hearth and built the fire back up. The cabin warmed quickly. She found the last of the bread and a little of the broth she had ipete warm through the night. When she turned back to the table, the boy's eyes were open. They were bright again, the old weariness softened by sleep, and by the simple fact that he had woken to the same faces that had stayed with him through the dark. He sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. Lydia brought the food to him and set it on the table. She did not speak at first. She only watched as he ate, small bites at first, then steadier as his strength returned. Silas stood near the hearth, his massive frame outlined by the morning light. He had not slept much either. His storm-gray eyes moved between the boy and Lydia with the same steady watchfulness he had shown since the platform. The boy finished the broth and set the spoon down. He looked at Lydia for a long moment, the way he had looked at Motbi her scar the first time he arrived. Then he slid from the chair and crossed the small space between them. He stopped in front of her, his small bare feet on the clean floorboards. Without asking, he reached up Vekepite, hot one hand, and touched the thin pale line that ran from her left temple, along her cheekbone to the edge of her jaw. His fingers were light. The touch was curious rather than afraid. Lydia held very still. No one had touched the scar since the fire, except the healers who had bandaged it in the first days. No one had looked at it the way the boy was looking now, and as if it were simply another part of her face, like the curve of her cheek or the line of her brow. "It looks like a dragoness mark," the boy said. His voice was small but clear in the quiet cabin. "Like the princess in the stories who fought the dragon and lived. The scar is where the fire tried to take her. But she would, let it. That's what it means. Is it. Lydia felt the words land somewhere deep behind her ribs, in the place she had ipete closed, since the night her brother struck the match and locked the door. She had heard many things about the scar in the month since. It was a curse. It was proof of guilt. It was the reason no one would ever want her. She had never heard anyone call it the mark of a survivor. She had never heard anyone say it made her look like someone who had fought and won. Her eyes stung. She blinked once. Hard. And covered the boy's small hand with her own, where it rested against her cheek. The warmth of his palm was steady. She did not pull away. She let the touch remain. Let the innocent words settle into the cracks she had thought were sealed forever. "It means I lived," she answered. Her voice came out quieter than she had intended, rough at the edges. "That's all." The fire tried to finish something, and it did not succeed. The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense. He left his hand where it was for another moment, then let it drop. He looked at Silas, who had not moved from his place by the hearth. "Uncle Silas said you chose to stay even when the pastor said you should go," the boy said. "He said the town is coming today to try to make you leave. But you stayed last night when Mott was sick. That means you re the princess, not the joke." Lydia felt something crack open inside her chest. It was not a loud breaking. It was the slow, quiet giving way of ice that had been frozen too long. She looked at the boy, at his bright eyes and the small hand that had touched her scar without fear or pity, and saw herself reflected in a way no mirror and no cruel whisper had ever shown her, not as the scarred bride sent as punishment, not as the punchline of her family's joke, but as someone who had survived and who had chosen, in the middle of a storm, to fight for a child who needed her. She knelt so they were eye to eye. The mended hem of her dress pooled around her boots. She took both of the boy's small hands in hers. "Moat, I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not today. Not because the pastor says so. Not because the town forgets what steady hands can do. Moat stayed through the storm because you needed someone to stay. That is what Mott will keep doing." The boy smiled, the small, shy smile she had seen when he ate the candy and when he managed a few even stitches. He squeezed her hands once, then let go and turned to Silas. "Does that mean she gets to be my mother now?" he asked. The question was direct. The way children ask the things adults circle around for years. Silas' jaw worked once. His storm-gray eyes met Lydia's across the small space. He did not answer for the boy. He answered for her. "That is her choice," he said. "And it is yours to ask. But the town is coming to take that choice away if they can. They are already on the road." As if his words had summoned them, the sound of horses and voices reached the cabin again. Not the single rider from before. Not the 3 men who had come the first time. This was a larger group. Multiple horses. Multiple voices speaking over one another in the clear morning air. The pastor's voice rose above the others, carrying the same practiced righteousness it had held at the fair. Lydia stood. She kept one hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and warm. Silas crossed to the door and opened it a crack. The morning light spilled in, bright after the storm. Down the washed-out road, a group of riders was already visible, 10 or more men on horseback, the pastor at their head, the 2 townsmen from before flanking him. They rode with purpose, as if the storm and the boy's illness had given them all the proof they needed to finish what her family had begun. Silas closed the door. The latch clicked. He turned back to Lydia and the boy. His massive frame blocked most of the light from the window now. The storm-gray eyes were flat and final again, but when he looked at her, there was something new in them. The same quiet approval he had given when she won the ribbon, and when she pulled the boy through the fever. "They are coming here, instead of waiting for the church," he said. The storm gave them the story they wanted. A scarred woman and an orphan, alone on the mountain during the worst weather of the season. They will say the boy almost died because of you. They will say the only way to protect him is to remove him from this cabin today. Lydia felt the words land. She looked at the boy, who had moved closer to her side and was now holding the edge of her mended hem again. She looked at Moff, the ribbon on the table, and the pot of herbs that had saved him. She thought of the clearing, and the vow, and the way the boy's small hand had touched her scar, and called it the mark of a survivor. She met Silas' eyes. "Then we meet them outside," she said. "Not hiding. Not begging. The boy stays with me. The ribbon stays with me. And if they want to finish the joke in front of him, they will have to do it while looking at the woman who stayed awake through the storm and the man who chose her anyway." Silas nodded once. He crossed to the peg and took down his heavy wool coat. He draped it over her shoulders the way he had done so many times before, adjusting the collar with 2 careful fingers. Then he knelt in front of the boy and placed both large hands on the child's thin shoulders. "You stay close to Lydia," he said. "No matter what they say. No matter what they threaten. You are not a burden. You are not a reason to send anyone away. You are the reason we stand." The boy nodded. His small hand found Lydia's again. Outside, the horses had reached the yard. Boots hit the ground. Voices rose. The pastor called her name and Silas's name and the boy's name, demanding they come out and face what the storm had proven. Lydia opened the door. The morning light was bright and cold. The group of riders had dismounted and stood in a loose half-circle in the yard. The pastor stood at the center, his face set in the same righteous lines. The 2 townsmen flanked him. Behind them stood others, men and women from the fair, some who had nodded at her ribbon, some who had looked away. All of them watched as she stepped onto the porch, with the boy at her side and Silas filling the doorway behind her like a mountain that would not be moved. The pastor's eyes went straight to the scar, then to the boy's hand holding her mended hem. Then, to the blue ribbon she had pinned to her dress that morning. "The storm has shown us the truth," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "The fire follows her. The boy nearly died because of it. We have come to take the child to safety, and to end this mockery before it destroys what little decency remains in this valley." Lydia felt the boy's small hand tighten on her hem. She felt Silas's presence at her back, steady and unyielding. She felt the ribbon against her chest, like a small, bright weight she had earned. They kept hot, steady hands and a night spent fighting for a child who had called her scar the mark of a survivor. She lifted her chin. The morning wind moved the pines and carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin. She looked at the pastor and the gathered townspeople and spoke in a voice that did not tremble. "The storm showed us something else," she said. "It showed us who stays when the wind howls and the fever rises. It showed us that a child can see strength where others see only a scar. And it showed us that the joke you came to finish is already over, because Mot am still here. And the boy is still breathing. And the man behind me has chosen us both." The yard went quiet. The pastor's mouth tightened. One of the townsmen shifted his weight. Behind them, a few faces in the crowd looked uncertain for the first time. Lydia kept her hand on the boy's shoulder and her eyes on the pastor. The ribbon caught the morning light. The mended hem brushed the porch boards, and for the first time since the stagecoach had carried her up this mountain, she did not feel like the punchline of someone else's story. She felt like the woman the boy had seen when he touched her scar, a survivor who had chosen to stay, and who would keep choosing, no matter how many storms or how many voices tried to finish what her family had begun. The pastor did not back down when Lydia spoke. His face tightened further, the lines of practiced righteousness deepening, as he looked from her to the boy still holding her mended hem, and then to Silas filling the doorway behind her. The crowd in the yard had grown quiet after her words about the storm and the ribbon and the choice to stay. Some faces had softened, others had closed again. The two townsmen flanking the pastor shifted their weight, hands resting on their belts as if they expected trouble. "We will not settle this on your porch like common gossip," the pastor said, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is a matter for the church and the community that must live with the consequences. You will come to the churchyard. Now. The gathering Mot called has already begun. The people deserve to see the truth of what you have brought to this mountain before any more storms or fevers decide the matter for us." Silas did not move. His massive frame remained a wall between the yard and the cabin. Lydia felt the boy's small hand tighten on her hem. She looked down at him, then back at the pastor. Going to the churchyard meant facing the full weight of the town in the place where blessings and condemnations were spoken aloud. Staying here meant the confrontation would happen on their terms, but it would also mean the boy remained at the center of it. She thought of the night just past, the steam and the cloths and the whispered words that had pulled him back. She thought of the ribbon pinned to her dress and the way the boy had touched her scar and called it the mark of a survivor. "We will come," she said before Silas could refuse. Her voice was quiet but steady. "The boy stays with us. No one touches him. No one speaks to him as if he is a burden to be removed." The pastor nodded once, as if this small concession had already been granted in his mind. The group turned. Horses were mounted again. The ride to the church was short but felt longer under the eyes of the riders who flanked them. Silas drove the wagon with Lydia and the boy on the seat beside him. The mended hem of her dress brushed the boy's leg. The blue ribbon caught the morning light each time the wagon rocked. No one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of wheels, the jingle of harness, and the distant murmur of voices already gathered at the church. The churchyard was crowded when they arrived. People who had been at the fair the day before stood in clusters near the steps. Some held the same expressions they had worn when she won the ribbon. surprised, almost approving. Others looked away or whispered behind their hands. The pastor dismounted and climbed the steps to the small platform, usually used for announcements after Sunday service. The two townsmen took positions on either side of him. The crowd quieted as Silas helped Lydia and the boy down from the wagon, and they walked forward together. Lydia kept one hand on the boy's shoulder. Silas walked on her other side, his presence a silent wall. The morning sun had dried the grass from the storm, but the air still smelled of wet earth and pine. The church doors stood open behind the pastor, the dark interior visible like a mouth waiting to speak judgment. The pastor raised his hands. His voice carried across the yard without effort. We have gathered here today because a storm and a fever have shown us what letters and rumors could not. A scarred woman was sent to this mountain as a joke by her own blood. She has brought trouble and illness to an orphaned child who deserves better than to be caught in the middle of another family's cruelty. No pastor in this valley will ever bless a union built on such foundations. The scar she carries is not merely a mark of survival. It is a mark of misfortune that has no place in a holy covenant. I refuse, in the sight of this community and before God, to give any blessing to this arrangement. It is unfit. It must end. The words landed like stones. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. Lydia felt the boy's hand find hers and hold tight. She kept her chin lifted, the way she had on the platform the first day. But inside, something shifted. She thought of the cabin, and the night she had stayed awake, fighting for the child beside her. She thought of Silas, steady nods, and the way he had draped his coat over her shoulders again and again. She thought of the ribbon and the boy's small fingers on her scar and the words that had cracked something open she had believed was sealed forever. She stepped forward before Silas could speak. Her voice was quiet at first, then stronger as it carried. "Mort will go," she said. The yard went still. "The boy can stay with Silas. He has already lost too much. Mort will not be the reason he loses more. The joke my family began ends with me. Mort will leave the mountain today. The cabin and the child and the man who chose me will be free of it." The offer hung in the air like the steam from the herb pot the night before. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply the truth of what she was willing to give to spare the two people who had become her reason for staying. She felt Silas's presence shift beside her, but she did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the pastor and the crowd, offering the only thing she had left that might protect the boy and the quiet life Silas had built. The boy's small hand tightened on hers until it hurt. She felt rather than saw Silas move closer, his massive frame now directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even through the coat he had given her. "No," Silas said. The single word was low and final, the same tone he had used on the platform when he claimed her, and at the door when he sent the rider away. "She stays. The boy stays. The choice was never yours to make for us." The pastor's face darkened. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Lydia raised her hand slightly, stopping him. She turned to Silas then, her eyes meeting the storm gray that had watched her through the storm and the fever and every small act of care since the stagecoach stopped. "More, I'm offering this, so you and the boy do not have to carry the weight of the town's anger," she said. Her voice meant for him even though the yard could hear. "The ribbon and the herbs and the night Mort stayed awake do not change what they see when they look at my face. If my leaving ends it for you both, then Mort will go. It is not sacrifice if it keeps the child safe and keeps you from having to fight every day for something the valley has already decided is unfit." Silas' jaw worked once. His eyes did not leave hers. When he spoke, his voice was rough but clear enough for every person in the yard to hear. "You are not leaving, not because of them, not because of a mark on your face that a child saw as strength. Not because a pastor believes misfortune can be read in a scar. The boy already knows who stayed when the fever rose. Moat already know who mended they kept hat. A tay was torn and stirred what would feed us. The town can refuse a blessing. They cannot refuse the truth of what you have already done here. The boy had moved closer to Lydia's side. His small body pressed against her leg. He looked up at Moat Fay, the pastor, with the same old eyes that had studied her scar. She stayed when the storm came, the boy said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. You didn't. The princess stays. The dragon does to get to win, just because it has a loud voice. A ripple moved through the crowd, some soft laughter, some uncomfortable shifting. A few nods from the people who had seen the ribbon and the way she had worked at the fair. The pastor's mouth tightened further. He raised his hands again, but the authority in his voice had frayed at the edges. This is not a storybook, he said. This is a community that must live with the consequences of one man's stubbornness and one woman's misfortune. If she will not leave of her own will, then the child must be removed for his own protection. We will not allow an orphaned boy to be raised under the shadow of a curse and a joke. The words were the final line. Lydia felt them land. She had offered to leave to spare Silas and the boy the shame and the fight. The pastor had taken her offer and turned it into a threat against the child. She looked at Silas. His storm-gray eyes were no longer flat. They burned with the same controlled fury she had seen when the rider brought the first message. His hands, loose at his sides until now, had curled into fists. The crowd waited. The morning wind moved through the pines around the churchyard. The church doors stood open behind the pastor, like an invitation no one had accepted. Lydia stood between the boy and the gathered town, the mended hem of her dress brushing the grass, the blue ribbon bright against the faded calico, and felt the full weight of the choice she had made when she opened the cabin door, the night the fever rose. She had offered the sacrifice. The town had refused it and demanded more. Silas stood at Moat Fay, her back like a mountain that would not be moved. And the boy still held her hem, as if letting go would mean the dragon won after all. The pastor opened his mouth to speak again. Silas took one step forward, his massive frame now between Lydia and the platform. His voice, not when it came, was low and carried farther than the pastor's had. You will not take the boy, he said. You will not finish this joke on my mountain or in this yard. If the church will not bless what we have chosen, then the mountains will. And if you try to remove the child from the only home he has left, you will do it over me. The yard went completely still. The pastor's face had gone pale beneath the righteousness. The two townsmen took half a step back. In the crowd, someone gasped. Lydia felt the boy's hand in hers, and Silas's presence like a wall at her back. She thought of the clearing, and the vow and the night she had fought the fever with herbs and cloths, and the choice to remain. The pastor's next words were quieter, but they carried the weight of final judgment. Then there is nothing left to discuss here. The church has spoken. The community has seen. If you will not send her away, and you will not surrender the boy, then the town will act to protect what remains of its decency. This ends today. He turned and walked into the church, the two townsmen following. The crowd began to disperse in uneasy clusters, some glancing back at Lydia and Silas, and the boy with expressions that ranged from pity to fear to the first hints of doubt. Lydia stood in the churchyard with the mended hem brushing the grass, and the blue ribbon catching the light, and the boy's small hand still holding hers, and understood that the cruel joke her family had begun had reached its final stage. She had offered the sacrifice. It had not been accepted. The only thing left was the stand Silas had promised from the beginning. The one that would either finish the joke for good or break what little remained of the quiet life on the mountain. She looked up at him. His storm-gray eyes met hers. The nod he gave her was the smallest one yet, almost private. "We go home," he said. "We prepare. They will come again before the day is out. And this time, they will not leave until one of us has given way." Lydia nodded. She turned with the boy still at her side and walked back to the wagon. Silas followed, his massive frame a shadow that kept the morning sun from reaching her back. The church doors remained open behind them, empty now, waiting for whatever would happen next. The ribbon stayed pinned to her dress. The mended hem still brushed the grass with every step, and the boy's small hand in hers felt like the only anchor left in a world that had decided the joke was not finished after all. The wagon had not yet rolled out of the churchyard when the first of the townsmen stepped forward. He was one of the two who had flanked the pastor at the cabin and again on the platform. His face was set in the same hard lines as before, but now there was purpose in his stride. Two others moved with him. They did not look at Lydia or at Silas. Their eyes were on the boy, who still sat on the wagon seat between them, one small hand clutching the edge of her mended hem. "The pastor has spoken," the man said, his voice loud enough for the remaining crowd to hear. "The child is not safe here. We are taking him to the neighbor's until this is settled. Step aside." Lydia felt the boy press closer to her side. Silas had already set the brake and climbed down. He stood in front of the wagon now, his massive frame blocking the path to the boy. His storm-gray eyes were no longer flat. They burned with the same controlled fury she had seen when the first rider brought the letter and when the pastor had threatened to remove the child. "The boy stays with us," Silas said. The words were low, but they carried across the yard like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "You will not touch him." The man took another step. His two companions flanked him. The crowd that had begun to disperse paused and turned back. Some faces showed fear. Some showed the same uncertainty that had appeared when Lydia spoke of the storm in the ribbon. The pastor had gone inside the church, but his words still hung in the air like smoke. Lydia slid down from the wagon seat, keeping the boy behind her. The blue ribbon on her dress caught the morning light. The mended hem brushed the grass. She had offered to leave in the churchyard to spare Silas and the boy the shame and the fight. The town had refused that offer and demanded the child instead. The sacrifice had not been accepted. It had only made the threat sharper. She looked at Silas. His jaw was tight, the muscle along it working once. His hands, loose at his sides until now, had curled into fists. She knew what was coming before he moved. She had seen the same shift in him when he filled the doorway of the cabin and when he had sent the rider away. This was the moment the quiet protection became something louder. "Elias," Silas said, his voice low and steady, meant only for the boy. "Stay with Lydia. Do not move from her side." The boy nodded once, his small hand still holding her hem. Silas did not look back. He turned and strode toward the church steps. His boots struck the ground. They kept a hot, heavy, deliberate sound. The crowd parted without being asked. The three men who had tried to reach the boy hesitated, then followed at a distance, their confidence faltering as Silas's massive frame climbed the steps and stopped in front of the open church doors. The doors were heavy oak, dark with age and polished by years of hands. They stood open from when the pastor had entered, the dark interior visible like a mouth that had already spoken its refusal. Silas stopped in front of them. For a moment, he simply stood there, his back to the yard, his shoulders rising and falling with the deep, steady breaths of a man who had reached the edge of what silence could hold. Then he moved. He did not shout. He did not raise his fists against any person. He placed Beote hat large hands on the edge of the nearest door, fingers gripping the old wood where the hinges met the frame. He pulled. The wood groaned. He pulled again, with the raw, protective power of a man who had watched a child nearly die in a storm, and who would not watch that same child be taken now. The hinge on the upper side gave first a sharp crack that echoed across the yard like a branch snapping in high wind. The lower hinge followed. Splinters flew. The heavy oak door swung outward on its broken hinges and struck the stone step with a sound that silenced every remaining voice in the churchyard. Silas did not stop. He turned to the second door and did the same. His hands found the wood. His shoulders bunched under the wool shirt, and he wrenched it free with the same controlled fury. The second door fell outward, landing beside the first. The sound of splintering wood and tearing metal hinges rang through the yard and up into the pines. When it was done, the church stood open and exposed, its dark interior visible to every person who had come to watch the joke finished. Silas stood in the ruined doorway, his chest rising and falling, his hands still curled at his sides. He did not look at the pastor, who had appeared in the doorway behind him, with a face gone white. He did not look at the three men who had tried to take the boy. He turned slowly and looked at Lydia, where she stood beside the wagon with the boy still holding her hem. The yard was completely silent. No one moved. The wind that had moved through the pines after the storm found the open church and whispered through the empty space where the doors had been. The sound was soft and strange against the stunned quiet. Lydia felt the boy's small hand tighten on her hem until the fabric pulled. She looked at Silas standing in the broken doorway, his massive frame outlined against the dark church interior, and understood what he had just done. He had not struck any person. He had not raised his voice in threat. He had taken the symbol of the town's refusal, the heavy oak doors that had stood between her and any blessing, and he had torn them open so that nothing stood between his choice and the light. The act was louder than any sermon the pastor had preached. It declared, in splintered wood and stunned silence, that this bride was his to defend, and that no door, no pastor, and no gathering of townspeople would be allowed to finish the joke that had begun with a locked door and a match. The three men who had tried to reach the boy took a step back. The pastor remained in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing without sound. In the crowd, someone gasped. Another person turned and walked away quickly, as if the sight of the broken doors had burned something they could not unsee. A few faces, women who had nodded at the ribbon, men who had watched Silas carry supplies without complaint, looked at Lydia with something new in their eyes. Not approval, not yet, but the beginning of doubt. Silas walked back down the steps. His boots crunched on the scattered splinters. He stopped in front of Lydia and the boy. His storm-gray eyes met hers. The fury had not left them, but it had settled into something steadier, something that had chosen its ground and would not be moved from it. "They will not take him," he said. The words were quiet, meant for her and the boy. "They will not finish this here. Not today." Lydia nodded. She could not speak yet. The image of him wrenching the doors open was still burning behind her eyes. The power of it, the protection in it, the way he had made the church itself open so that no one could hide behind its refusal. She reached down and lifted the boy into the wagon seat, then climbed up beside him. Silas climbed up on the other side. The wagon rolled forward. The crowd parted without being asked. No one tried to stop them. The three men who had come for the boy stood where they were, staring at the broken doors, as if they could not quite believe what they had seen. As the wagon left the churchyard and turned onto the road that led back up the mountain, Lydia kept one hand on the boy's shoulder. The blue ribbon was still pinned to her dress. The mended hem lay smooth across her knee. She looked back once. The church stood vacant, hot, its doors gone, the dark interior exposed to the morning light. The pastor and the remaining townspeople were small figures now, standing in the yard like people who had come to watch a joke end, and had instead watched something else begin. The boy leaned against her side. His small voice was barely above a whisper. "You stayed," he said. "And Uncle Silas broke the doors so they could to take me." That means the princess wins. Does it? Lydia looked down at him. His storm-gray eyes were bright again, the fever and the fear of the morning, replaced by something steadier. She thought of the night she had fought for him with herbs and cloths and whispered words. She thought of the ribbon and the touch on her scar, and the way Silas had chosen her again and again without ever asking her to earn it. She nodded. The princess wins today, she said. But the dragon does not give up easily. They will come again. They will bring more than words next time. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small carved wooden horse Silas had given him. He placed it in her hand. You keep it, he said, for when the dragon comes back. It is braver when it has something to protect. Lydia closed her fingers around the small horse. The wood was warm from the boy's pocket. She looked at Silas, who drove with steady hands, his jaw still tight but his eyes on the road ahead. The wagon climbed the mountain road, the pines closing in around them again. Behind them, the church stood with its wits gone. Ahead of them, the cabin waited on the rise, the place where she had mended a hem and stirred a stew and stayed awake through a storm for a child who had called her scar the mark of a survivor. The joke her family had begun had reached the church and been met with splintered wood and a man who would not accept her sacrifice. But, as the wagon rolled higher and the sound of the broken doors faded behind them, Lydia understood that the stand was not finished. The town had been stunned into silence. It would not stay silent for long. The dragon had been pushed back today. It would return, and when it did, the cost would be higher than a pair of oak doors and a morning of stunned faces. She held the carved horse in one hand, and the boy's small fingers in the other. The blue ribbon rested against her chest. The mended hem brushed the wagon floor. And as the cabin came into view between the pines, she knew that whatever came next, whatever the town brought up the mountain road, she would meet it with the same hands that had mended and stirred and stayed. Because the boy had called her a survivor. Because Silas had torn open the doors rather than let her go. And because the quiet life on the mountain had become worth fighting for, in ways the cruel joke had never intended. The wagon stopped in the yard. Silas set the brake. He climbed down and came around to help her and the boy. His hands were steady at her waist, the same careful touch he had used since the first day. He did not speak of the doors. He did not speak of the sacrifice she had offered or the way he had refused it. He simply looked at Motfefer with the storm-gray eyes that had chosen her on the platform and had chosen her again in the churchyard. We prepare, he said. They will not wait long. Lydia nodded. She lifted the boy down and took his hand. Together they walked toward the cabin door. Behind them, the mountain road was empty. Ahead of them, the fire waited to be built, and the stew pot waited to be filled again. The joke was not finished. But for the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped turning, Lydia did not feel like the one who had been nailed here to be broken. She felt like the woman who had been chosen, protected, and seen, and who would keep choosing, keep staying, and keep fighting, until the dragon learned that some fires cannot be finished with doors or decrees, or the laughter of a town that had forgotten what steady hands could do. The wagon rolled into the yard as the afternoon light slanted through the pines. The cabin stood waiting, smoke already curling from the chimney, where Silas Mo Uete have left the fire banked before they left that morning. Lydia climbed down with the boy still at her side, his small hand in hers. The blue ribbon on her dress had not moved. The mended hem brushed the packed earth. Silas set the brake and came around to them without speaking. His storm-gray eyes met hers for a long moment, then dropped to the boy. Inside, the cabin felt smaller after the churchyard. The pot of herbs still sat on the table. The ribbon from the fair rested where she had tayet before the fever. Silas added wood to the fire and stood with his back to it, his massive frame outlined by the rising flames. Lydia guided the boy to the chair near the hearth and wrapped the mended blanket around his shoulders again. The carved wooden horse sat on the table where she had placed it. She picked it up, and turned it in her fingers, the wood warm from the boy's pocket and from her own hand. "We cannot wait for them to come again," Silas said after a while. His voice was low, rough from the day. "The doors will not hold them forever. The pastor will bring more men. They will say the broken church is proof that Mot have lost my mind and that the boy is in danger. We need to finish what we started before they finished it for us." Lydia looked at him across the small space. She thought of the clearing where they had sat the night he first offered the mountain vow. She thought of the river that ran behind the cabin, the one that had whispered in the dark when he spoke of simple vows under the trees. The church had refused. The doors had been torn open. The town had seen. But the boy still needed to know that what they had chosen was real, witnessed and held by something stronger than oak or a pastor's decree. "The grove by the river," she said. "The one where we talked about the mountains making their own vows. We go there tonight. The boy comes with us. We speak Vekep Hatate needs to be spoken under the pines and the stars. Then whatever comes tomorrow, he will know that we chose each other and him in front of something that cannot be broken with doors or decrees." Silas nodded once. The same small nod he had given when she finished the hymn, and when she won the ribbon, and when she pulled the boy through the fever. He crossed to the trunk and took out the heavy wool coat he had draped over her so many times. He held it out. She slipped her arms into it without being asked. The weight settled around her shoulders like the blanket she had wrapped around the boy. He adjusted the collar with 2 careful fingers, the same touch he had used every time. They left the cabin as the last light faded from the sky. The path behind the cabin wound upward through thick pines, the needles soft under their boots. The boy walked between them, one hand in Lydia's and the other holding the carved horse. The river's sound grew louder as they climbed, the low, steady rush of water over stones that had been there long before any church or any town. The pines whispered above them, their tops moving in the evening wind that had returned after the storm. The grove opened between the trees where the river curved, and the pines thinned enough to let the first stars show. Moonlight silvered the water and the needles on the ground. Silas stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face her. The boy stood between them, small and quiet, the carved horse clutched in both hands now. Silas looked at Lydia for a long moment, the storm-gray eyes steady in the moonlight. "Mot have no ring," he said. His voice was rough but clear. "Mot have no pastor and no church. Mot have only this place and the choice. Mot made the day you stepped down from the stagecoach. Mot choose you, Lydia. Not because the town approved, not because a letter told me to. Because you stayed when the storm came and the fever rose. Because you mended what was torn and stirred what would feed us. Because a child touched your scar and saw strength instead of shame. Mot will protect what we have built here with everything Mot have left. That is my vow." Lydia felt the words settle in the same place the boy's small hand had touched her scar. She looked at Silas. Towering, massive, silent until the moment protection required sound, and saw the man who had given her the better mug and the nod and the space to work and the coat that had become hers. She looked at the boy, who watched them with bright eyes that had already decided. The dragon could not win if they stood together. She reached into her pocket and took out the blue ribbon. She folded it once and placed it in Silas' large palm. Her voice trembled only once before it steadied. "Mot have no ring either," she said. "Mot have only the hands that mended and the heart that chose to stay when every voice said I should run. Mot choose you, Silas. Not because you tore open the doors, because you gave me the space to become more than the joke my family sent. Because you let a child see me as a survivor instead of a burden. Because you stood between me and every cruelty without ever asking me to earn it. Mot will stand with you and with this boy against whatever comes next. That is my vow." The boy stepped closer. He took the carved wooden horse and placed it in Lydia's free hand, then took her other hand and placed it in Silas's. The 3 of them stood in a small circle under the whispering pines, the river moving beside them, and the moonlight silvering the needles at their feet. No pastor spoke, no crowd watched. Only the mountains and the river, and the boy who had already decided that the princess stayed, and the dragon lost when people chose each other anyway. Silas closed his fingers gently around hers. He did not squeeze. He simply held on, the way he had steadied her elbow on the platform and on the trail, and every time the wind had tried to push her off balance. Lydia felt the weight of his hand, and the small warmth of the boy's fingers, and the ribbon folded in her palm. Like a promise, she had earned Vekepite hot steady hands, and a night spent fighting for someone else's child. They stood that way for a long time. No more words were needed. The vows had been spoken in the simplest language they knew: protection and choice, and the refusal to let a cruel joke finish what it had started. The boy eventually sat on a fallen log and leaned against Lydia's leg, the carved horse back in his hands. Silas draped his coat more fully around her shoulders when the night air cooled. She leaned into the warmth without asking. The river whispered. The pines moved above them. And for the first time since the stagecoach had carried her up this mountain, Lydia felt the full weight of belonging settle into her bones. They walked back to the cabin as the moon climbed higher. The boy fell asleep against her side before they reached the yard. Silas carried him the last part of the way and laid him on the bunk near the hearth. He covered him with the mended blanket and stood for a moment with one large hand resting on the boy's dark hair. Lydia watched from the table, the blue ribbon still folded in her hand. When Silas turned back to her, the storm-gray eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He did not speak of the churchyard or the broken doors or the town that would come again. He only reached out and touched the edge of the ribbon where it rested in her palm, the same careful touch he had used with every small thing he had given her since the first day. "The mountains have witnessed it," he said. "The river has heard it. The boy has seen it. Whatever comes tomorrow, we have already chosen. That is enough for tonight." Lydia nodded. She slipped the ribbon into her pocket and let him guide her to the chair by the fire. He poured the last of the coffee into the chipped mug and set it in front of her. She wrapped her hands around the warm enamel and let the heat move through her fingers. Outside, the wind had gone still. The pines no longer whispered. The river moved in the distance, steady and unchanging. She looked at Silas across the small table. He had chosen her on the platform when the crowd laughed. He had chosen her in the clearing when he offered the mountain vow. He had chosen her in the churchyard when he tore open the doors rather than let her sacrifice herself. And tonight, under the pines in the moon, he had chosen her again in front of the only witness who mattered. An 8-year-old boy who had touched her scar and called it strength. The joke her family had begun had tried to finish her with a locked door and a match, and a letter nailed to a giant on a mountain. Instead, it had brought her here, to a cabin where a man had given her the better mug, and a child had seen her as a survivor, and the mountains had witnessed vows that no pastor could refuse. The town would come again. The dragon would not stay stunned forever. But tonight, with the chipped mug warm in her hands, and the boy sleeping under the mended blanket and Silas's storm-gray eyes steady across the table, Lydia allowed herself to believe that the cruel joke had already lost. She took a slow sip of the coffee. It tasted of pine and wood smoke, and the quiet that had grown between them since the first day. She set the mug down and met Silas' gaze. "Tomorrow they will come," she said. "But we have already won something they cannot take, Vekepite hot doors, or decrees, or the laughter of a town that forgot what steady hands can do." Silas nodded. The same small nod. The one that had come to mean more than any words he had ever spoken. "We have," he said. "And we will keep winning it. One storm at a time. One choice at a time. One night like this at a time." The fire popped and settled. The boy breathed deeply in his sleep. The river whispered in the distance. And in the cabin on the mountain, with the mended hem of her dress pooled around her boots, and the blue ribbon folded in her pocket, and the man who had torn open the church doors sitting across from her, Lydia felt the story that had been written about her finally bent toward the ending she had chosen for herself. The joke was not finished, but the woman who had been sent as its punchline had already begun to write something else in its place. Something built from herbs and stitches and vows, spoken under whispering pines. And whatever came with the morning, she would meet it with the same hands that had mended and stirred and stayed. Because the boy had called her a survivor. Because Silas had chosen her without ever asking her to earn it. And because the mountains had witnessed it all. The fire burned steady. The night held. And for the first time since the stagecoach wheels had stopped turning, Lydia allowed herself to rest. The first snow came early that year, soft flakes that drifted down between the pines and settled on the cabin roof like a blanket drawn up for sleep. By the time the second storm arrived, the mountain road had disappeared under white, and the world beyond the yard had gone quiet in the way only high country winters can manage. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady in the stone hearth. The mended blanket lay folded at the foot of the boy's bunk. The blue ribbon from the fair had been pinned above the shelf where Lydia kept her thread and needles, a small bright square against the dark logs. Lydia woke before the others most mornings now. She moved quietly around the cabin, adding wood to the fire, setting the coffee to brew in the pot that had once held only Silas's solitaire grounds. The chip mug sat side by side on the table. She no longer gave him the worse one without thinking. He no longer reached for it first. The rhythm had changed without either of them naming it. She poured for both of them, set his mug in the place he liked, and carried hers to the window, where the snow had drifted against the glass. The boy, Elias, slept deeply under the extra blanket she had tucked around him the night before. His dark hair stuck up in the back the way it always did. The carved wooden horse sat on the floor beside the bunk where he had dropped it in sleep. She crossed to him and knelt, smoothing the blanket over his small shoulders and tucking the edge under his chin the way she had done the night of the fever. Her hands no longer hesitated. The reluctance that had once clenched in her chest when she reached for him had eased into something warmer, something that felt less like duty and more like the simple fact of belonging. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. The scar along her own cheek no longer felt like the only story written on her skin. The boy had touched it once and called it the mark of a survivor. Silas had torn open church doors rather than let anyone take the child from the home they were building. The town had gone quiet after that day. Not gone, but quieter. Whispers still reached them on the rare trips down for supplies. The pastor still spoke from the broken church steps, but no one had come up the mountain road again with demands or threats. Not yet. The snow had helped. The broken doors and the stand in the churchyard had helped more. Lydia stood and returned to the fire. Silas was awake now, sitting in the chair he had once taken by habit and now shared without needing to ask. He watched her with the same storm-gray eyes that had met hers, on the platform, and in the clearing and across the table, every night since the vows under the pines. He did not speak. He only reached for the mug she had poured, and gave her the small nod that had come to mean more than most men's long speeches. She sat across from him. The mended hem of her dress, repaired again after a snag on a nail, brushed the floorboards. She picked up the piece of needlework she had begun the week before, a small square meant for the boy's winter coat, and began to stitch. The needle moved in even lines. The thread pulled smooth. Silas watched her hands, the way he had watched them, the night she mended the torn hem and the night she taught the boy to stitch. The quiet between them had grown deep and easy, filled with the crackle of the fire, and the soft sound of her thread, and the steady breathing of the child sleeping nearby. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It muffled the world until the only sounds were inside the cabin. The fire, the needle, the occasional shift of the boy in his sleep. Lydia thought of the platform and the laughter and the letter on the mantel. She thought of the rider and the pastor's cold decree and the night she had stayed awake with herbs and cloths while the storm howled. She thought of the clearing and the simple vows spoken under the whispering pines and the moon. The reluctant hands that had once feared opening to a child, or a man or a life that could be taken away had found their work. They mended. They stirred. They tucked blankets. They reached for both the boy and the man across the table without the old hesitation. The boy stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes with small fists. He looked first for her, the way he had begun to do every morning. When he saw her at the table with the needlework, he smiled, the small, shy smile that still caught her off guard with its trust. "Story?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Lydia set the needlework aside. She crossed to the bunk and sat on the edge, pulling the blanket up around him again, even though he did not need it. She told him the story of the girl who learned to mend torn things so well that even the wind could not find the holes anymore. The same story she had told on the first day he arrived. He listened with his chin on his knees, the carved wooden horse in his hands. When the story ended, she smoothed his hair and tucked the blanket one more time. "Stay warm," she said. "The snow is deep today. We will not go down the mountain." The boy nodded. He reached out and touched the edge of her sleeve. A small, automatic gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "You stayed," he said. The same words he had spoken after the churchyard. "Even when they tried to make you go." "I stayed," she answered. "And Mort will keep staying." Silas rose from his chair and crossed to the hearth. He added another log and settled the burning pieces so the flames would last through the morning. When he turned back, he carried 2 thick slices of the bread she had baked the day before and set one on the table near her needlework. He did not speak of the snow or the town or the quiet that had settled over the mountain. He only gave her the same small nod and returned to his chair. They ate in the comfortable silence that had grown between them. The boy eventually climbed from the bunk and joined them at the table, the carved horse placed carefully beside his plate. Lydia watched him eat and felt the same quiet certainty that had been growing since the night of the fever. The reluctance that had once made her hands hesitate at the door when he first arrived had become something else entirely. She reached across the table now without thinking, adjusting the collar of his shirt the way Silas adjusted hers. She told him stories without being asked. She tucked him in without the old fear that caring would only lead to loss. The snow fell heavier through the morning. By midday the yard was buried and the pines were heavy with white. Silas went out to check the woodpile in the small shed where they stored what supplies they had. He returned with snow on his shoulders and in his beard, stamping his boots at the door before coming inside. Lydia met him with a cloth to brush the snow away. He stood still under her hands, the same way he had stood still the first time she reached for him. When she finished, he caught her wrist gently and held it for a moment, his large fingers warm against her skin. "The town is quiet," he said. "The snow has kept them down in the valley. But it will not last forever." Lydia nodded. She knew the peace was temporary. The broken doors and the stand in the churchyard had bought them time, not surrender. The pastor still preached, the whispers still traveled. But for now, with the snow deep and the cabin warm and the boy safe between them, the quiet felt like something earned rather than borrowed. She turned back to the table and picked up the needlework again. Silas sat across from her. The boy played with the carved horse on the floor near the fire, making small sounds of hooves in snow. The fire crackled, the needle moved. The snow whispered against the window. And in the cabin on the mountain, with the mended hem of her dress pooled around her boots, and the blue ribbon pinned above the shelf, and the man who had chosen her sitting across the table, Lydia allowed herself to feel the full, gentle unfolding of what had begun as reluctant care, and had become something she no longer wanted to name with old fears. She reached across the table once more, not for the needlework this time, but for Silas's hand. He met her halfway, his large palm closing around hers, with the same careful strength he had used since the platform. The boy looked up from his play and smiled again. The small, shy smile that said he had already decided this was home. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire burned steady. and for the first time since the stagecoach had carried her up this mountain, Lydia did not measure the days by how much she had survived. She measured them by the stories she told, the blankets she tucked, the stitches she made, and the quiet certainty that had grown in her hands and her heart. The reluctant mother who had once feared opening to a child who could be taken away had become the woman who reached for him without hesitation. The woman who had been sent as a joke had become the one who stayed when every voice said she should run. And the man across the table, the giant who had torn open church doors rather than let her go, watched her vacep hot eyes that had chosen her from the first day and had never looked away. The snow fell. The fire held. The cabin on the mountain held the three of them like a secret the valley had not yet managed to take. And Lydia, with the mended hem and the blue ribbon, and the small hand that had touched her scar and called it strength, allowed herself to believe that hot to mornings and tucked blankets and long silences that felt like home was the ending the cruel joke had never intended, but the one she had chosen anyway. She squeezed Silas' hand once. He squeezed back. The boy played on. The snow whispered against the glass. And in the gentle unfolding of winter, the woman who had once been mailed here as punishment found herself exactly where she had never dared to hope she belonged. Spring returned to the mountain in slow stages, the way it always did, first a softening of the air, then the drip of melting snow from the cabin eaves, then the first green pushing through the brown needles on the forest floor. The road down the mountain reappeared in patches of mud and stone. The pines that had carried the weight of winter began to shake it off in showers of water and last year's cones. Inside the cabin, the fire no longer needed to be fed from dawn until dark. The mended blanket had been washed and folded away. The blue ribbon still hung above the shelf, where Lydia kept her thread and needles, a small bright square that caught the longer light each afternoon. She stood at the open door one morning in early spring, a shawl draped over her shoulders and the mended hem of her faded blue calico dress brushing the threshold. The yard was a patchwork of white and brown where the snow had retreated. Silas stood near the woodpile, his massive frame swinging the axe in steady, powerful arcs that split the seasoned logs cleanly. Each swing carried the same quiet certainty he had shown since the first day she stepped down from the stagecoach. The boy, Elias, played near the edge of the cleared ground, the carved wooden horse in one hand and a new stick he had found that morning in the other. He made small sounds of hooves and wind, the same sounds he had made all winter when the snow kept them close to the hearth. Lydia watched them both and felt the full weight of what had changed settle into her bones. The cruel joke her family had begun with a locked door, a match, and a letter mailed to a giant on a mountain had tried to finish her. It had tried to make her small enough to be forgotten. Instead, it had brought her here, to a cabin where a man had given her the better mug without ever asking her to earn it, to a child who had touched her scar and called it the mark of a survivor, and to a winter of tucked blankets and long silences that had slowly become home. A sound on the road drew her attention. 3 figures appeared between the pines, women and a man she recognized from the fair and the churchyard. They walked slowly as if unsure of their welcome. One of the women carried a small basket. The man carried a bundle of split wood balanced on one shoulder. They stopped at the edge of the yard and waited, their faces cautious but not cruel. Lydia stepped onto the porch. Silas paused in his chopping, the axe resting against his leg. The boy looked up from his play and moved closer to her side without being told. She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, automatic, the way her hands had learned to reach for him without the old hesitation. The woman with the basket took one step forward. It was the same woman who had taken Lydia's entries at the fair and later nodded when the ribbon was given. She set the basket on the ground between them. "We brought some of last year's apples," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain, "and some thread the mercantile had left over. Thought you might have use for it with the mending." She glanced at the boy, then at Silas, then back at Lydia. "The pastor still preaches. Some still listen. But not all of us. The snow gave us time to think. The doors you broke gave us something else to remember. Silas set the axe down and crossed the yard. He picked up the basket and the bundle of wood without a word, then gave the woman the same small nod he had once given Lydia when she finished the torn hem. The nod that said the work mattered. The nod that said some things did not need long speeches to be understood. The three visitors did not stay long. They left the gifts and turned back down the road, glancing once over their shoulders, as if to make sure the cabin still stood and the people inside it were still safe. When they were gone, Lydia remained on the porch with the boy at her side and Silas returning to the woodpile. She watched him swing the axe again, steady, powerful, the same rhythm that had split wood and torn open church doors and built the quiet life she had never dared to imagine for herself. The boy tugged her hand. "They brought apples," he said. "Can we make something with them? Like the preserves you won the ribbon for?" Lydia looked down at him. His storm-gray eyes were bright, with the simple excitement of a child who had spent a winter learning that some people stayed and some stories could be rewritten. She smoothed his hair with her free hand, the same gesture she had used the night of the fever and every night since. "We can," she answered. "We will make them together. You can stir while Moat measure. And when they are done, we will put one jar on the shelf next to the ribbon." The boy smiled the small, shy smile that still caught her off guard with its trust. He ran back to his play near the woodpile, the carved horse in one hand and the new stick in the other. Silas glanced up from his chopping, met Lydia's eyes across the yard, and gave her the same small nod. She answered with one of her own. She remained on the porch a little longer, the shawl around her shoulders and the mended hem brushing the boards. The mountain air smelled of wet earth and pine and the faint sweetness of melting snow. In the distance, a few more patches of green showed where the road curved. The cabin behind her held the warmth of the fire and the scent of the coffee she had poured that morning, and the quiet that had grown between three people who had chosen other when the world tried to finish a cruel joke instead. Lydia thought of the platform and the laughter and the letter on the mantel. She thought of the rider and the pastor's cold decree and the night she had stayed awake with herbs and cloths while the storm howled. She thought of the clearing and the simple vows spoken under the whispering pines and the moon. She thought of the churchyard and the broken doors and the way Silas had refused her sacrifice and chosen her again in front of the whole town. She thought of the winter of tucked blankets and stories and the small hand that had touched her scar and called it strength. The cruel joke her family had begun with fire and rejection, and a letter mailed to a giant had tried to break her. It had tried to make her the punchline that would be forgotten. Instead, it had led her here, to a cabin where a man chopped wood kept hot, steady hands, and a boy played with a carved horse, and the mountains had witnessed vows that no pastor could refuse. It had led her to the truest family she had never dared to imagine, and the gentlest love she had never believed she deserved. She touched the blue ribbon pinned to her dress. The fabric was soft from the winter, and from her fingers, tracing it on the nights when the old fears tried to return. It had not erased the scar. It had not erased the past, but it had become part of the new story, the one she had written. They kept a hat, steady hands, and a choice to stay when every voice said she should run. Silas finished splitting the last log and stacked it with the others. He wiped his hands on his wool shirt and turned toward the porch. The boy ran to him, the carved horse held high like a trophy. Silas lifted the child onto his shoulders with the same careful strength he had used to lift Lydia onto the wagon seat the first day. The boy laughed, the sound bright and clear in the spring air. Lydia watched them from the doorway and felt the last of the old reluctance slip away. The hands that had once clutched a torn hem and traced a scar in the dark now reached for both of them without fear. The heart that had once measured every kindness by how much it might cost now beat steady with the certainty that some choices were worth the risk. The cruel joke had led her to this. The fire that had tried to finish her had instead brought her to the man who had torn open doors, rather than let her go, and the boy who had seen strength where others saw only misfortune. The destiny forged in cruelty had become the quiet life she had never dared to hope for. A cabin on a mountain, a ribbon above the shelf, vows spoken under whispering pines, and the simple daily work of mending and stirring and tucking in and choosing, again and again, the family that had grown from the ashes of someone else's joke. She stepped back inside the cabin. The fire crackled. The coffee pot sat on the hearth. The mended blanket waited to be used again when the nights turned cool. Outside, Silas chopped the last of the wood, and the boy played with the carved horse in the spring light, touched the green, pushing through the snow. And Lydia, with the blue ribbon against her chest, and the scar along her cheek, and the hands that had learned to reach without hesitation, allowed herself to believe that the cruel joke had already lost. It had tried to nail her away as punishment. Instead, it had brought her home. The snow had melted. The road had opened. The town had sent its first cautious visitors with apples and thread, and the beginning of something that might one day become respect. But more than any of those things, the mountain itself had changed. The pines that had once witnessed only silence now held the memory of simple vows spoken under moonlight. The cabin that had once held only one man and his quiet endurance now held the sound of a child's laughter, and the steady rhythm of a woman's needle, and the low voice of a giant who had chosen to tear open doors rather than let love be refused. Lydia moved through the small tasks of the morning, with hands that no longer measured every gesture by how much it might cost her later. She poured coffee into Tehat chipped mugs, and set Silas in the place he liked without thinking. She folded the mended blanket and placed it at the foot of the boy's bunk, already imagining the stories she would tell when the next cool night came. She pinned the blue ribbon higher on the wall so the morning light would catch it and remind her, on the days when old fears tried to return, that she had earned something the cruel joke had never intended her to have. Silas came in from the woodpile and washed his hands at the basin near the door. He did not speak of the visitors or the apples or the cautious respect that had begun to replace outright cruelty. He only crossed to her, placed one large hand at the small of her back in the same careful way he had adjusted her coat and her shawl, and every small thing since the first day, and stood with her at the window while the boy played outside. The gesture was quiet. It asked for nothing. It simply said that he was there, and that he would remain. The boy ran in a little later, with muddy boots and bright eyes, the carved wooden horse held high. He placed it on the table between the two chipped mugs, as if it belonged there. Lydia did not move it. She only smiled and reached out to smooth his hair, the same gesture she had once hesitated to offer, and now performed without thought. Silas watched them both, with the storm-gray eyes that had chosen her on the platform, and had never looked away since. In that moment, with the spring light touching the green outside, and pine drifting through the open door, the last of the old reluctance slipped away completely. She had been sent here as a punishment, a joke, a scarred bride no one was meant to want. Instead, she had become the woman who stayed when the storm came, and the fever rose, who mended Vekephatate was torn, and stirred what would feed them, who spoke simple vows under whispering pines, and watched a child call her scar the mark of a survivor. The cruel joke had tried to break her. It had tried to make her small enough to be nailed away and forgotten. Instead, it had forged something stronger than any door the town could build or break. A family built from ashes and choice, and the steady daily work of hands that had learned to reach without fear. The visitors would come again. The pastor would still preach. The whispers would not vanish overnight. But the mountain had already decided what the town had not yet accepted, that some jokes, when met with quiet strength and unwavering protection, simply lose their power. The fire that had once tried to finish her had instead lit the way to the truest family she had never dared to imagine, and the gentlest love she had never believed she deserved. Lydia stood at the window with Silas's hand at her back, and the boy's small presence filling the cabin with life, and allowed herself to rest in the ending she had written for herself. The cruel joke had led her here, and here, with the mended hem and the blue ribbon, and the vows that no pastor could refuse, was exactly where she was meant to remain. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, spaces, and locations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This story is intended for a general audience and adheres to family-safe, PG-rated guidelines with no graphic violence, explicit content, or harmful themes.